The late afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows of the Victorian house on Maple Street, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors that creaked with every step. Sarah Mitchell Crawford had been married to David Crawford for 3 years now, but this was the first time she'd ventured into the cramped attic space above their bedroom. The ladder wobbled slightly under her weight as she climbed up with a flashlight clenched between her teeth and a determination to finally organize the chaos that had accumulated over decades. Cedar Rapids, Iowa, had been David's home his entire life, and this house had belonged to his family since the 1940s. When they'd married, Sarah had moved from Chicago, leaving behind her corporate law career to start fresh in this small Midwestern town where everyone knew everyone else's business. She'd embraced the change, finding peace in the slower pace and the genuine warmth of neighbors who brought casseroles when you were sick and remembered your birthday without Facebook reminders. David had been hesitant about her cleaning out the attic. "There's nothing important up there," he'd said that morning over coffee, his weathered hands wrapped around his favorite mug, the one with a faded logo from the local hardware store where he'd worked for 20 years. "Just old Christmas decorations and junk from when my parents were alive." But Sarah had insisted. They were planning to convert the space into a home office for her new freelance legal consulting business, and she couldn't work surrounded by cobwebs and mysterious boxes. The beam of her flashlight swept across the cramped space, illuminating stacks of cardboard boxes, old furniture covered in white sheets, and the skeletal framework of the roof. The air was thick with dust, and the august, musty smell of things long forgotten. She began methodically, starting with the boxes nearest the ladder. Most contained exactly what David had predicted: Christmas ornaments wrapped in yellowing tissue paper, old photograph albums from his childhood, his father's military uniforms from Vietnam, and his mother's collection of ceramic angels. But it was in the far corner, behind a dresser that had clearly been deliberately positioned to obscure it, that Sarah found something that made her heart skip a beat. A small metal box, about the size of a shoebox, painted deep burgundy with brass corners that had tarnished with age. What caught her attention wasn't the box itself, but the heavy padlock securing it shut, and the way it had been hidden, as if someone had very intentionally didn't want it to be found. She lifted the box carefully, surprised by its weight. Something inside shifted with a soft thudding sound, like papers or photographs sliding against the metal. The lock was substantial, clearly meant to keep secrets safe. Sarah examined it in the beam of her flashlight, noting that despite the box's age, the lock seemed relatively new, certainly newer than the decades-old items surrounding it. "Sarah? You okay up there?" David's voice drifted up from below, making her jump. The box slipped slightly in her hands, and she gripped it tighter against her chest. "I'm fine," she called back, her voice sounding strangely hollow in the confined space. "Just sorting through things. Don't overdo it. Come down soon, and I'll help you with the heavy stuff." She waited until she heard his footsteps retreat down the hallway before examining the box again. There was something carved into the brass plate on the front. Initials, she realized. LMC. The letters were delicate, feminine script, clearly, engraved by someone who'd taken time and care with the task. LMC. Sarah frowned, trying to think of anyone in David's family with those initials. His mother had been Margaret, his father Robert. His sister lived in California and was named Patricia. She'd never heard him mention anyone whose name started with L, and certainly no one with the middle initial M. The rational part of her mind suggested she should take the box downstairs and ask David about it directly. Married couples shouldn't have secrets, especially not locked away in attics. But something held her back. Perhaps it was the deliberate way the box had been hidden. or the careful positioning of the dresser to block it from view, or simply the way David had been so adamant that there was nothing important in the attic. Instead, she carefully made her way back down the ladder, the locked box tucked under her arm. David was in the kitchen, preparing dinner as he did every evening at exactly 5:30. He'd changed from his work clothes into his standard evening outfit, worn jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. His graying hair was still damp from his post-work shower, and he hummed softly while chopping vegetables for their salad. "Find anything interesting?" he asked without looking up from the cutting board. Sarah hesitated, the weight of the box suddenly feeling heavier in her hands. "Just the usual stuff. Old photos, decorations. I'll need to rent a storage unit for some of the furniture." David nodded, still focused on his chopping. "I told you it was mostly junk. My parents never threw anything away." She slipped quietly upstairs to their bedroom, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't quite articulate. In the back of their shared closet, behind her winter coats, she found a spot where the box could sit safely hidden while she figured out what to do about it. As she positioned it carefully behind a garment bag, her fingers traced the carved initials once more. LMC. 3 letters that somehow felt like they were about to change everything. Sarah spent the next 2 days trying to concentrate on her work, but the locked box in the closet seemed to call to her every time she passed their bedroom. She'd find herself pausing in the doorway, looking toward the closet, imagining what secrets might be contained within that burgundy metal container. During her lunch break on Wednesday, she'd even driven to the hardware store downtown, ostensibly to buy organizational supplies for the attic project, but really to see if they sold the type of lockpicks she'd seen in movies. Marcus Hendricks, the elderly owner of Hendricks Hardware, had given her a curious look when she'd asked about lock removal tools. "Having trouble with an old padlock, Mrs. Crawford?" His weathered face had creased into a knowing smile. "Happens to the best of us. You could try bolt cutters, but if it's a family heirloom or something sentimental, I'd recommend taking it to Jimmy Barnes over at the locksmith shop on 3rd Street. He can usually open old locks without damaging them too much." The idea of involving a locksmith felt too public, too official. Cedar Rapids was a small town, and word traveled fast. If she took a mysterious locked box to be opened, everyone would know about it by dinner time. Besides, what would she say? That she'd found it hidden in her own attic and her husband didn't know about it? That evening, as they sat down to David's meticulously prepared dinner of pot roast and mashed potatoes, Sarah decided to test the waters with casual conversation. "I was thinking about family history today," she said, cutting her meat with perhaps more attention than necessary. "You know, for the genealogy project I mentioned." David looked up from his plate, fork halfway to his mouth. "What genealogy project?" "The one I mentioned last month. About researching both our family trees?" She hadn't actually mentioned any such project, but it seemed like a natural enough interest for a new wife to have. "Oh, right." He resumed eating, though she noticed he seemed less enthusiastic about his dinner now. "What about it?" "Well, I realized I don't know much about the women in your family. Your mother's side, specifically. Were there any important female relatives I should know about? Maybe someone with the initials LM?" The question hung in the air between them. David's chewing slowed, and Sarah watched his face carefully for any reaction. For just a moment, something flickered across his features. Surprise, perhaps? Or recognition? But it passed so quickly she might have imagined it. "LM?" He shook his head slowly. "Can't think of anyone." "Why those particular initials?" "Oh, no reason. I just thought I remembered you mentioning someone once." Sarah forced herself to take another bite, though her appetite had completely disappeared. Maybe I was thinking of someone else's family." They finished dinner in relative silence, David occasionally commenting on local news or asking about her work. But Sarah noticed he kept glancing at her when he thought she wasn't looking. And his usual post-dinner routine of reading the newspaper in his recliner was replaced by restless tidying in the kitchen that lasted much longer than necessary. Later, that night, as they lay in bed with David's breathing deep and even beside her, Sarah stared at the ceiling and thought about the conversation. His reaction to the initials LM had been subtle, but it had definitely been a reaction. Someone with those initials meant something to him, even if he wasn't willing to admit it. She waited until she was certain he was deeply asleep before slipping out of bed and retrieving the box from its hiding place. In the dim light from the hallway, she examined it again, looking for any detail she might have missed. The brass corners were definitely tarnished, but the engravings were still clear. The lock itself was a master lock, the kind you could buy at any hardware store, but it was in good condition despite the age of the box. On impulse, she tried David's birthday in various combinations on the lock. First month and day, then year, then all 6 digits. Nothing. She tried their wedding anniversary, her birthday, even his parents' birthdays that she'd memorized from family photos. The lock remained stubbornly closed. It was nearly 2 in the morning when she finally gave up and returned the box to its hiding place. As she settled back into bed, David shifted slightly in his sleep, murmuring something she couldn't quite make out. But in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, with the locked box just feet away in the closet, Sarah found herself wondering what other secrets her husband might be keeping. The woman with the initials LMIC, whoever she was, had been important. Enough to own a locked box that someone had very deliberately hidden in David Crawford's family home. And despite his claim that he couldn't think of anyone with those initials, Sarah was becoming increasingly certain that David knew exactly who LMC was. The question was, why was he lying about it? The Cedar Rapids Public Library occupied a stately brick building on 2nd Avenue that had served the community since 1902. Sarah had discovered it during her first month in town, drawn by its high ceilings, oak reading tables, and the comforting smell of old books that reminded her of research sessions during law school. Now, 3 days after her failed conversation with David about family history, she found herself back at the library with a very specific research goal in mind. Margaret Kelly worked the reference desk every Thursday morning, and she'd proven invaluable during Sarah's previous visits when she'd been researching local history for a freelance project. A retired schoolteacher with gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and reading glasses that perpetually hung from a beaded chain around her neck, Margaret knew everyone in Cedar Rapids and seemed to remember everything that had ever happened in the town's 150-year history. "Well, hello there, Sarah," Margaret said warmly as Sarah approached the desk. "What brings you in today? More research for your consulting work?" "Actually, I'm working on a family history project," Sarah said, settling into the chair beside Margaret's desk. "I'm trying to learn more about the Crawford family, particularly any women who might have been part of the family in recent decades." Margaret's eyes lit up with interest. "The Crawfords? Oh, they're one of our old families. Robert Crawford's grandfather started the lumber mill back in the 1920s. David's a good man. Took care of his parents right up until they passed. Such a devoted son. I'm particularly interested in women who might have been connected to the Ur family in the 1990s, Sarah continued carefully. Perhaps someone whose first name started with L. Something shifted in Margaret's expression, a subtle tightening around her eyes that Sarah had learned to recognize from her legal career as the look of someone who knew more than they were comfortable sharing. The 1990s, Margaret repeated, slowly. Well, That was a difficult time for David. You know about his first marriage, of course? Sarah felt her breath catch. His first marriage? Margaret looked surprised. Oh my, I assumed… Well, I thought surely he would have told you. It was such a tragedy. Laura was such a lovely girl. The older woman paused, clearly flustered. Perhaps I shouldn't be the one to… Laura, Sarah repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. L for Laura. What happened to her? Margaret glanced around the nearly empty library, then leaned closer. She disappeared, dear. Right after their wedding. It was 1992, just about 33 years ago now. They'd had this beautiful ceremony at St. Matthew's, and then she just vanished. Never found a trace of her. The room seemed to spin slightly around Sarah. David had been married before. His first wife had disappeared, and he'd never mentioned either fact in the 3 years they'd been together. What was her full name? Sarah managed to ask. Laura Marie Coleman. Well, Crawford after the wedding, but she'd only been married for 2 days when it happened. Margaret's voice dropped to the conspiratorial whisper that librarians everywhere seemed to perfect. Some people thought she'd just run off. You know how it is, getting cold feet after the ceremony. But her family never believed that. They said she was so excited about being married, about starting her life here in Cedar Rapids. Laura Marie Coleman, LMC, the initials on the locked box. Do you remember what she looked like? Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Oh, she was beautiful. Petite little thing with the most gorgeous auburn hair. She'd grown up in Iowa City but moved here after college to work at the bank. That's how she met David. He was doing some renovation work at the bank building. Margaret paused, studying Sarah's face with growing concern. Are you all right, dear? You look quite pale. Sarah forced herself to breathe normally. I'm fine. It's just surprising to learn about this. David hasn't mentioned her. Well, I suppose that's understandable. It was such a traumatic time for him. The poor man searched for months, worked with the police, even hired a private investigator, with money he couldn't afford to spend. He blamed himself, you know, thought he should have been able to protect her somehow. What did the police think happened? Margaret shook her head sadly. They investigated for years, but there was just no evidence of foul play. No signs of struggle, no demands for ransom. Nothing. Her car was found in the parking lot at Millers Creek Park, but there was no indication of what happened to her after that. Some folks thought she might have had an accident and fallen in the creek, but they dragged it and found nothing. And David never remarried until now? Not until you, dear. He kept to himself for years afterward, threw himself into his work, took care of his aging parents. I think most people assumed he'd never get over losing Laura. Margaret reached across and patted Sarah's hand gently. But then you came along, and it was wonderful to see him happy again. You've been such a blessing in his life. Sarah managed a weak smile, though her mind was racing. Margaret, do you happen to know if the police kept files on the case? Oh, I'm sure they did. Missing persons cases like that, especially when someone just vanishes without a trace, they keep those files indefinitely. Sheriff Wilson was just a deputy back then, but he worked the case extensively. He might be able to tell you more, though I'm not sure why you'd want to dig into such a painful part of David's past. Why indeed? Sarah thanked Margaret and left, the library in a daze, her mind struggling to process this new information. David had been married before. His first wife had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and somewhere in their attic, hidden behind furniture, was a locked box with his first wife's initials on it. As she walked to her car, Sarah found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about her husband. If he'd kept something as significant as a previous marriage secret, what else might he be hiding? And why would he have kept a locked box belonging to his missing wife hidden in the attic all these years? The locked box suddenly felt less like a mystery to be solved and more like a door she might not want to open. But Sarah had been a lawyer long enough to know that secrets, once discovered, demanded investigation. Whether she wanted to or not, she was going to have to find out what was inside that box, and she was going to have to decide whether to confront David about his lies. The Lynn County Sheriff's Office occupied a modern brick building on the outskirts of Cedar Rapids, its architecture a stark contrast to the older buildings that dominated the downtown area. Sarah sat in her car in the visitor parking lot for nearly 10 minutes, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she tried to gather the courage to walk inside. She'd spent the previous evening staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep as her mind cycled through everything Margaret had told her about Laura Marie Coleman. David had left for work that morning at his usual time, kissing her goodbye with the same gentle affection he'd shown every day for the past 3 years. He'd reminded her to call the electrician about the outlet in the kitchen that had been sparking, asked if she needed anything from the hardware store, and mentioned that he'd be working late on a cabinet installation project. Everything had been completely normal, which somehow made his deception feel even more profound. Inside the sheriff's office, a receptionist with kind eyes and graying hair directed Sarah to Sheriff Tom Wilson's office. The sheriff was a large man in his early 60s with calloused hands and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades dealing with the darker aspects of human nature. His office walls were covered with commendations, family photos, and a large map of Lynn County marked with colored pins that Sarah preferred not to think about too carefully. "Mrs. Crawford," Sheriff Wilson said, rising from behind his desk to shake her hand. "What can I do for you today?" Sarah had rehearsed her approach during the drive over, but now, faced with this imposing figure of authority, her carefully planned words seemed to evaporate. "I'm here about a cold case," she said finally, "from 1992, the disappearance of Laura Marie Coleman." Sheriff Wilson's expression shifted immediately, his professional mask slipping just enough to reveal surprise and something that might have been concern. "That's a name I haven't heard in a while. May I ask what your interest is in the case?" "Laura was my husband's first wife." The words felt strange coming out of her mouth. "I only learned about her yesterday, and I'd like to understand what happened." The sheriff gestured for her to sit in one of the chairs facing his desk, then settled back into his own chair with a heavy sigh. "David never told you about Laura?" "No. We've been married for 3 years, and he's never mentioned being married before." Sheriff Wilson was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his desk blotter. "That case has haunted me for over 30 years, he said finally. "I was a deputy then, one of the first responders when her disappearance was reported. I've worked hundreds of cases since then, but Laura Coleman's file is one of the few that still keeps me up at night. Can you tell me what happened?" "What I can share with you? Yes." He pulled a thick manila folder from a filing cabinet behind his desk. "The official report states that Laura Marie Coleman Crawford was last seen on June 15, 1992, at approximately 4:30 p.m., leaving her workplace at First National Bank. She'd been married to David Crawford 2 days earlier, on June 13th. They'd had a small ceremony at St. Matthew's Catholic Church, followed by a reception at the Legion Hall." Sarah noticed how carefully he recited the facts, as if he'd memorized them long ago. She was supposed to meet David at home at 5:30 for dinner. When she didn't arrive, he called the bank and was told she'd left on time. He waited until 7 p.m. before calling us. We found her car at Millers Creek Park at approximately 9:45 p.m. that evening. Margaret at the library mentioned that. Was there any evidence in the car? Her purse was on the passenger seat, wallet intact with credit cards, and $43 in cash. Her wedding ring was in the cup holder. Sheriff Wilson opened the file and consulted a report. No signs of struggle in the vehicle. No blood, no indication of forced entry or violence. She took off her wedding ring? That detail always bothered me. Why would a newlywed take off her wedding ring? David said she'd been having trouble with the sizing. It was a little loose. But that seemed like an odd thing to do if she was just going for a walk in the park. Sarah felt a chill. You think she was meeting someone? I think a lot of things, Mrs. Crawford, but I can't prove any of them. We searched that park for weeks, brought in dogs, dragged the creek, had volunteers combing through every inch of woods, found nothing. What about David? Was he ever considered a suspect? Sheriff Wilson's hesitation was telling. In cases like this, we always look at the spouse first. David had an alibi for the time she disappeared. He was at a job site with 2 other workers until 5:15, then stopped at the grocery store before going home. Store cameras confirmed his presence there at 5:25. Timeline-wise, it would have been very difficult for him to have been involved in her disappearance. But you had doubts. I had questions. David's behavior during the investigation was unusual. He was cooperative, answered all our questions, even took a polygraph test that he passed. But there was something about his emotional responses that never quite sat right with me. What do you mean? Grief is a complicated thing, Mrs. Crawford. People react differently to trauma. But in my experience, when someone you love disappears without a trace, there's a particular quality of desperation, of frantic hope mixed with fear. David seemed more resigned than I would have expected, like he'd already accepted that she was gone. Sarah thought about David's careful, controlled nature, his methodical approach to life, the way he rarely showed strong emotions even in their most intimate moments. It was one of the things that had attracted her to him after a string of relationships with more volatile men, but now she wondered if there was something else beneath that steady surface. Have there been any developments in the case over the years? Nothing substantial. We've reopened it a few times when new technology became available. DNA testing, improved database searches, that sort of thing. But without any physical evidence or new witnesses, there's only so much we can do. Sheriff Wilson closed the file and leaned back in his chair. Mrs. Crawford, can I ask what prompted this inquiry? It's unusual for someone to come asking about their spouse's previous marriage, especially a case like this. Sarah hesitated. Should she mention the locked box? Her instincts told her she wasn't ready to reveal that particular piece of information, not until she knew more about what it contained. I just learned about Laura's existence yesterday, she said finally. I'm trying to understand why David would keep something so significant secret. It makes me wonder what else he might not have told me. That's understandable, but I'd caution you to be careful about digging into old wounds. Whatever happened to Laura Coleman, it destroyed David for a long time. I watched him struggle for years afterward. When I heard he'd remarried, I was genuinely happy for him. Sometimes the past is better left buried. As Sarah left the sheriff's office, Wilson's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes the past is better left buried. But what if the past wasn't buried? What if it was locked in a metal box, hidden in an attic, waiting to be discovered? She drove home slowly, taking the long way through downtown Cedar Rapids. As she passed St. Matthew's Catholic Church, she found herself wondering what Laura had been thinking on her wedding day. Had she been happy? Nervous? Excited about her new life? And why, just 2 days later, Had she removed her wedding ring before disappearing forever? That night, Sarah lay awake listening to David's steady breathing beside her, every fiber of her being focused on the locked box hidden in their closet. The conversation with Sheriff Wilson had only deepened her questions about her husband's past, and the weight of his deception felt heavier with each passing hour. When the digital clock beside their bed read 2:17 a.m., and she was certain David was in deep sleep, she carefully slipped out of bed and retrieved the box once again. This time, she took it downstairs to the kitchen, where she could turn on a small light without risk of waking David. Under the warm glow of the pendant light, over their breakfast nook, she examined the box more thoroughly than ever before. The burgundy paint was chipped in several places, revealing silver metal underneath. The brass corners were definitely tarnished, but the engravings remained clear and precise. LMC in delicate script, clearly done by a professional engraver. Chakra Titan tried to imagine Laura Coleman choosing this box, perhaps as a young woman starting her career at the bank, needing a place to keep important documents or precious keepsakes. The weight suggested it contained more than just papers, perhaps jewelry, photographs, or personal items that had meant something to David's first wife. She spent another 20 minutes trying different combinations on the lock. Laura's birthday was likely a possibility, but Sarah didn't know when that was. She tried various dates from 1992, their wedding date, the date Laura disappeared, common birthdays and anniversaries. Nothing worked. The lock seemed almost to mock her efforts, remaining stubbornly closed despite her growing desperation to know what secrets it contained. It was nearly 3 a.m. when she finally gave up and returned the box to its hiding place. As she slipped back into bed, David stirred slightly, making a soft sound that caused her heart to race. But he simply rolled over and continued sleeping, oblivious to her midnight investigation. The next morning brought one of those perfect Iowa autumn days that made Sarah understand why people chose to build their lives in small Midwestern towns. The maple trees that lined Maple Street were ablaze with red and gold, and the crisp air carried the scent of wood smoke from someone's fireplace. David left for work with his usual kiss and reminder to have a good day, leaving Sarah alone with her growing doubts and the knowledge that was burning a hole in her conscience. She tried to focus on her freelance work, but concentration proved impossible. Every sound from the house, the settling of old wood, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic on the street, seemed amplified. By noon, she'd accomplished nothing except wearing a path in the hardwood floor from her pacing. On a Tijuana impulse, she decided to drive by David's workplace. Crawford Custom Cabinetry operated out of a converted warehouse on the south side of town, and Sarah had visited a few times early in their relationship when David had wanted to show off his craftsmanship. She told herself she was just being supportive, perhaps bringing him lunch. But in truth, she wanted to observe him with fresh eyes, looking for signs of the man who could keep such monumental secrets. The workshop smelled of sawdust and wood stain, familiar scents that usually comforted her, but today seemed somehow ominous. David was bent over a partially assembled kitchen cabinet, his concentration complete as he fitted a door hinge with the precision that made him one of the most sought-after craftsmen in the area. He looked up with surprise and pleasure when he saw her. "Sarah, what brings you by?" He set down his tools and pulled off his work gloves to give her a kiss on the cheek. "Everything okay? I was just out running errands and thought I'd see how your project was coming along," she said, forcing a smile. "This is beautiful work." David's face lit up with the pride he always showed when discussing his craftsmanship. Cherry wood with a natural finish. The homeowner wanted something classic, but not too formal. He ran his hand along the smooth surface of the cabinet door. Should be done by next week. As he talked about wood grains and joinery techniques, Sarah found herself studying his face for any sign of deception or hidden depths. But this was the David she'd fallen in love with. Passionate about his work, gentle in his manner, completely present in the moment. It was hard to reconcile this man with someone who could keep such devastating secrets. "David," she said carefully, "I've been thinking about our conversation the other night. About family history and genealogy." His hands stilled on the cabinet, and she noticed the subtle tension that crept into his shoulders. "What about it?" "Well, I was wondering if maybe I could talk to some of your longtime friends or neighbors, people who knew your family when you were younger. It might help fill in some gaps in the family tree." "I don't really keep in touch with many people from back then," David said, turning back to his work. "And most of my parents' generation has passed away. I'm not sure you'd find much useful information." "What about people from the 1990s? Surely there are still folks around from that time period." The question hung in the air between them. David's hands had stopped moving entirely now, and Sarah could see the tension in the set of his jaw. For a moment, she thought he might finally tell her the truth about Laura. Instead, he turned to face her, with the expression she'd never seen before. Not angry, exactly, but closed off in a way that made her suddenly aware of how alone they were in the workshop. "Sarah, why all these questions about the past? We have a good life together. Why go digging around in old history that doesn't matter anymore?" "It doesn't matter?" The words came out sharper than she'd intended. "Your family history doesn't matter?" "You know what I mean." David's voice was strained now, and he glanced toward the door as if making sure they couldn't be overheard. "Some things are better left alone. Some memories are too painful to revisit." They stood there for a moment in the sawdust-scented air, looking at each other across a distance that seemed much greater than the few feet between them. Sarah felt as if she were seeing her husband clearly for the first time. Not the gentle, steady man she'd married, but someone capable of keeping enormous secrets and becoming defensive when questioned about them. "I should let you get back to work," she said finally. David nodded, relief visible in his features. "I'll see you at home tonight. Maybe we can go to Morrison's for dinner instead of cooking." As Sarah drove away from the workshop, she realized that David's suggestion about going out for dinner was likely motivated by more than just convenience. In a public restaurant, surrounded by neighbors and friends, it would be much harder for her to ask the kinds of questions that were burning inside her. But Sarah was beginning to understand that her husband was much more skilled at avoiding difficult conversations than she'd ever realized. And if she wanted answers about Laura Marie Coleman and the locked box hidden in their closet, she was going to have to be much more strategic in her approach. The question was, how far was she willing to go to uncover the truth about the man she'd married? Morrison's family restaurant occupied a corner building on First Avenue that had housed various eateries for over 50 years. The red vinyl booths and black and white checkered floor gave it a timeless American diner quality that attracted both longtime locals and newcomers to Cedar Rapids. Sarah and David had eaten there dozens of times during their marriage, usually sitting in their preferred booth by the window, where they could watch the evening foot traffic along the downtown sidewalks. Tonight, however, the familiar comfort of the restaurant felt forced. David had been unusually talkative during the drive over, commenting on everything from the weather to local politics to their neighbor's new fence, as if determined to fill every moment with words that would prevent more difficult topics from surfacing. Sarah played along, responding appropriately to his observations, while her mind continued to wrestle with everything she'd learned about Laura Coleman. They'd been seated for less than 5 minutes when Patricia Hoffman approached their table. Pat had worked at Morrison's for nearly 20 years and knew most of the regular customers by name. She was a woman in her late 50s with steel-gray hair and the efficient manner of someone who'd served thousands of meals and heard countless stories from the people of Cedar Rapids. "Evening, folks," Pat said, setting down water glasses and pulling out her order pad. "The usual for you both?" "Actually, Pat," Sarah said, struck by sudden inspiration, "I was wondering if you might remember someone from years back, someone who used to work at First National Bank in the early 1990s. Laura Coleman?" The change in atmosphere was immediate and palpable. Pat's expression shifted from friendly professionalism to something much more guarded, and Sarah felt David go rigid beside her in the booth. "Laura Coleman," Pat repeated slowly. "Now, that's a name I haven't heard in a long time." She glanced at David, who was staring down at his menu with intense concentration. "You knew Laura, didn't you, David?" "We were acquainted," David said, without looking up. Pat's eyebrows rose slightly at this obvious understatement, but she didn't push. Laura was a sweet girl. Came in here fairly regular for lunch when she worked at the bank. Always ordered the same thing, grilled cheese and tomato soup. Said it reminded her of home. Pat paused, studying Sarah's face with curiosity. "Any particular reason you're asking about her?" "I'm working on a family history project," Sarah said, using the same lie that was becoming increasingly uncomfortable to tell. "Laura's name came up in some old records, and I was trying to place her. Well, I can tell you she was well liked around town. Friendly, always had a smile for everyone. It was such a shock when she disappeared like that, right after her wedding, too." Pat's voice dropped to the confidential whisper that seemed to be the standard for discussing Laura Coleman. "Broke David's heart, didn't it?" David finally looked up from his menu, his face carefully neutral. "Pat, could we just order our food, please? Sarah and I are both pretty hungry." Of course." Pat pulled out her order pad again, but Sarah could see the questions in her eyes. "What can I get for you?" After Pat had taken their orders and moved away, silence settled over their table like a heavy blanket. David stared out the window at the evening pedestrians, his jaw tight. With tension, Sarah watched him carefully, noting the way his hands gripped his water glass and the muscle that twitched in his cheek. "David," she said finally, keeping her voice low, "we need to talk about Laura." "No," he said without turning from the window. "We don't. I know you were married to her. I know she disappeared right after your wedding. And I know you've been lying to me about it for 3 years." Now he did turn to look at her, and the expression in his eyes was unlike anything she'd ever seen from him before. Not anger exactly, but something colder and more remote. "What exactly do you think you know, Sarah?" "I know that Laura Marie Coleman worked at First National Bank. I know she married you on June 13, 1992. I know she disappeared 2 days later and was never found. I know her car was discovered at Millers Creek Park with her wedding ring in the cup holder." Sarah's voice remained steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "What I don't know is why you never told me any of this." David was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning the restaurant as if checking to see who might be listening. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because it's not something I talk about with anyone, ever. But I'm your wife, David. We're supposed to share our lives with each other." "Our lives," he repeated, "not my past. Laura has nothing to do with you and me." The coldness in his voice sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the restaurant's air conditioning. This wasn't the man she'd married, or perhaps it was, and she'd never seen this side of him before. "How can you say that? Your first wife disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and you don't think that affects our marriage?" "Because I've moved on," David said firmly. I dealt with that situation. I grieved, I healed, and I started over. With you. What happened to Laura is in the past. Pat returned with their meals, the appearance of food providing a temporary reprieve from the tension at their table. Sarah looked down at her chicken sandwich without appetite, while David immediately began eating his burger as if nothing unusual had happened. "David," Sarah said, after Pat had moved away again, "did you love her?" His chewing slowed, and for a moment his composure seemed to crack. When he looked at her this time, she saw a flash of something that might have been genuine pain. "More than I'd ever loved anyone," he said quietly. "Until you." The admission hung between them, and Sarah felt an unexpected stab of jealousy alongside her anger and confusion. She'd thought she was David's first great love, his fresh start at happiness. Learning that she was actually his second chance, his attempt to replace someone who had mysteriously vanished, fundamentally changed how she viewed their entire relationship. "What do you think happened to her?" David set down his burger and looked directly at her. "I think she realized she'd made a mistake marrying me, and she ran away to start over somewhere else. But her family never believed that. The police never believed that." "The police never found any evidence of foul play either," David replied. "Sometimes people just leave, Sarah. Sometimes they decide they want a different life, and they take it." Leaving her purse and car behind? Taking nothing with her? David shrugged, but Sarah could see the effort it took for him to maintain his casual demeanor. Maybe she had help. Maybe someone was waiting for her. Another man? I don't know. I've spent 33 years trying not to think about it. They finished their meal in near silence, the comfortable rhythm of their usual dinner conversation completely destroyed. As they walked to the car, Sarah found herself looking at David as if he were a stranger. The man she'd married was careful and methodical. Yes, but she'd never seen him be cold or dismissive about something that clearly caused him pain. During the drive home, she thought about Sheriff Wilson's observation that David had seemed resigned to Laura's disappearance rather than desperately hopeful. She thought about the locked box hidden in their closet, with Laura's initials carved into its brass nameplate. And she thought about the way David had just dismissed 3 decades of questions with a shrug and the suggestion that his first wife had simply run away with another man. None of it added up. And Sarah was beginning to suspect that the key to understanding what had really happened to Laura. Marie Coleman was sitting in a burgundy metal box just 10 feet from where her husband slept every night. The question was, what would she find when she finally managed to open it? Sarah woke up at 3:47 a.m. with a start, her heart pounding from a dream she couldn't quite remember. Beside her, David slept soundly, his breathing deep and regular, one arm thrown across his pillow. The digital clock cast a faint green glow in the darkness, and outside their window, the October wind rattled the branches of the old oak tree against the house. She lay there for several minutes, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar nighttime sounds of their home. But sleep wouldn't return, and her mind kept circling back to their dinner conversation at Morrison's. David's dismissive attitude about Laura's disappearance had bothered her more than she'd realized at the time. The man she'd married was many things: quiet, methodical, sometimes emotionally reserved. But he wasn't callous. Yet his suggestion that Laura had simply run away with another man had sounded almost cruel in its casualness. Unable to stand another minute of lying there with her thoughts spinning, Sarah slipped out of bed and padded quietly to the closet. The locked box seemed to call to her from behind the winter coats, its burgundy surface gleaming dully in the dim light from the hallway. She lifted it carefully, noting once again its surprising weight, and carried it downstairs to the kitchen. This time, Instead of trying random number combinations, she decided to approach the problem more systematically. She grabbed a notepad from the junk drawer and began making a list of every significant date she could think of related to Laura Coleman and David. Wedding date: June 13, 1992. Disappearance date: June 15, 1992. But she needed Laura's birthday, and David wasn't likely to provide that information willingly. Then she remembered Margaret at the library mentioning that Laura had worked at First National Bank. Bank employees would have had personnel files, emergency contacts, all the basic information that might include birth dates. And while the bank probably wouldn't give that information to a stranger, there might be other ways to find it. Sarah booted up her laptop and began searching online records. It took nearly an hour of patient digging through genealogy websites, old newspaper archives, and public records, but eventually she found what she was looking for. Laura Marie Coleman had been born on September 3, 1970, in Iowa City, Iowa. She'd graduated from the University of Iowa with a degree in finance and had started working at First National Bank in Cedar Rapids in early 1991. Sarah tried several combinations of Laura's birthday on the lock. 9-3, 9-3, 70. 3-9-3, 70. Nothing. She tried the wedding date again, and the disappearance date, and several other meaningful dates she could think of. Still nothing. Frustrated, she was about to give up when she noticed something she'd missed before. The lock itself was a master lock, Model 175, according to the tiny numbers stamped on its back. On impulse, she searched online for information about that particular model and discovered something interesting. Master Lock 175s manufactured in the 1990s had a known vulnerability. With the right technique and a thin piece of metal, they could be opened without the combination. Sarah looked around the kitchen for something that might work. She tried a bobby pin, but it was too thick. A paperclip was too flimsy. Finally, she remembered the small set of precision screwdrivers that David kept in the kitchen junk drawer for household repairs. The thinnest one might just work. It took 20 minutes of careful manipulation, following instructions she'd found on a lock-picking website. But eventually, she felt the lock mechanism give way with a small click. Her hands were shaking as she removed the padlock and lifted the lid of the box. The contents took her breath away. On top was a photograph of a young woman with auburn hair and bright green eyes, smiling radiantly at the camera. She was wearing a wedding dress, and the photo had clearly been taken at David and Laura's wedding reception. The woman was beautiful in an understated way, with delicate features and a joy in her expression that was almost heartbreaking to see. Beneath the photograph were more pictures: Laura at work, Laura with friends, Laura and David together at various local events. There were also personal items: a small jewelry box containing earrings and a necklace, a dried corsage that must have been from their wedding, and several letters in feminine handwriting. But it was the items at the bottom of the box that made Sarah's blood run cold. A driver's license belonging to Laura Marie Coleman, which should have been in her purse when she disappeared. A bank ID badge that she would have needed to get into work each day. Her wedding ring, the one that had supposedly been found in her car's cup holder. And underneath everything else, a small spiral notebook filled with what appeared to be journal entries in Laura's handwriting. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the notebook to a random page and began to read. June 8, 1992. David has been so strange lately. I know he's nervous about the wedding, but it's more than that. Sometimes I catch him looking at me with this expression I can't read. When I ask him about it, he just says he loves me so much it scares him. I wish I understood what he meant. By that, she flipped to another entry. June 12th, 1992 tomorrow is our wedding day. I should be the happiest woman alive, but I can't shake this feeling that something is wrong. David seemed almost angry tonight when I mentioned that I wanted to keep working at the bank after we're married. He said a wife's place is with her husband, not pursuing her own career. We've never talked about this before. I don't understand where this is coming from. The final entry was dated June 15th, 1992, the day Laura disappeared. I can't do this anymore. David isn't the man I thought I married. Last night he told me that I belong to him now, that he'll never let me leave him. When I said I needed some time to think, he grabbed my wrist so hard it left bruises. I'm scared of him. I'm going to pack a bag and go to my sister's house in Ames until I can figure out what to do. I just pray he doesn't try to follow me. Sarah sat in the kitchen darkness, the notebook open in her lap, as the full implications of what she'd discovered crashed over her. Laura hadn't run away with another man. She'd been planning to leave David because she was afraid of him. And somehow, David had her driver's license, her work ID, her wedding ring, and her journal. Items that should have been with her when she disappeared. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made her heart stop. She quickly closed the notebook and tried to stuff everything back into the box, but it was too late. David appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hair mussed from sleep and his eyes immediately focusing on the open box on the table. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made Sarah's skin crawl. "David, I can explain." "Can you?" He moved closer, and Sarah noticed that he was blocking her path to both the front and back doors. "Can you explain why you're going through my private belongings in the middle of the night?" "These belong to Laura," Sarah managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Her driver's license, her ring, her journal." "David, what happened to her?" David's expression changed, and for a moment, Sarah saw something in his eyes that Sheriff Wilson had missed all those years ago. Not grief or confusion or the pain of loss, but something much colder and more calculating. "Laura had an accident," David said quietly. "And now, you know too much." Sarah's mind raced as David moved closer, his presence suddenly feeling threatening in the warm kitchen that had always been a place of comfort and normalcy. The locked box sat open on the table between them, Laura's possessions scattered like accusations in the dim light. Sarah's hands shook as she gripped the notebook, Laura's final words still echoing in her mind. "I'm scared of him." "David, please," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just tell me what happened. I'm your wife. I love you. We can work through this together." David laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Work through it? Sarah, you have no idea what you've stumbled into." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, his movements deliberate and controlled. "I spent 33 years making sure no one would ever find that box." "Why did you keep her things? If she had an accident?" "Because it wasn't an accident." David's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather. "I killed her." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face, and her grip on the notebook tightened involuntarily. She'd suspected deep down that David's story about Laura running away wasn't true, but hearing him admit to murder so casually made her stomach lurch with terror. "You killed her," Sarah repeated, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. "I didn't plan it," David said, and Sarah caught a glimpse of what might have been genuine regret in his expression. "Laura was going to leave me. She said she'd made a mistake, that she needed time to think, but I couldn't let her go. So you killed her." She was being dramatic, threatening to leave over nothing. All I wanted was for her to calm down and listen to reason. But she wouldn't stop talking about going to her sister's house, about needing space, about how I was scaring her. David's voice grew harder. She was my wife. She belonged with me. Sarah thought about Laura's journal entry, about the bruises on her wrist, about David's possessive declaration that he would never let her leave. What exactly happened that day? David was quiet for a moment, his eyes focused on something beyond Sarah's shoulder. When he spoke again, his voice had a distant quality, as if he were recounting events that had happened to someone else. She came home from work that day with a suitcase, said she was going to stay with her sister for a while, that she needed to think about our marriage. I tried to reason with her, but she wouldn't listen. She kept saying she was scared of me, which was ridiculous. I would never hurt her. Sarah almost laughed at the irony of that statement, but she was too frightened to make a sound. When she tried to leave, I grabbed her arm to stop her. She pulled away and fell down the basement stairs. David paused, as if the memory still surprised him. It was an accident, really. But when I checked on her, she was dead. Broken neck. So you hid her body. I panicked. I loved her, Sarah. I never meant for her to get hurt. But she was dead, and I knew how it would look. A new bride tries to leave her husband and ends up dead? No one would believe it was an accident. So you staged her disappearance. David nodded, slowly. I drove her car to Millers Creek Park and left it there. Put her wedding ring in the cup holder to make it look like she'd taken it off deliberately. Then I came home and waited until a reasonable time to call the police. And her body is still in the basement, behind the old coal cellar wall that my grandfather bricked up in the 1950s. I just added a few more layers of brick and concrete. David spoke as if he were describing a home improvement project. No one ever had reason to look there. Sarah felt sick. Laura Marie Coleman had been in this house all along, sealed behind a wall in the basement while life went on above her. David had eaten dinner, watched television, slept peacefully, all while his murdered wife lay just beneath his feet. Why did you keep her personal things? For the first time since sitting down, David's composure cracked slightly. I loved her, he said simply. Even after what happened, I still loved her. Her driver's license, her jewelry, her words in that journal. They were all I had left of her. David, we have to call the police. You have to turn yourself in. David's expression hardened again. No, Sarah. I built a good life after Laura died. I took care of my parents. I established my business. I became a respected member of this community. And then I met you, and I was happy again. I'm not going to throw all of that away. You can't just pretend this didn't happen. Laura deserves justice. Her family deserves to know what happened to her. Laura's family moved away years ago. Her parents are probably dead by now. No one is looking for answers anymore except you. The implication in his words made Sarah's blood turn to ice. David, what are you saying? I'm saying that you know too much, and I can't let you destroy everything I've built. David stood up slowly, his movements still controlled, but now unmistakably predatory. I'm sorry, Sarah. I really did love you, but I can't let you leave. Sarah bolted from her chair, knocking it over as she ran toward the back door. But David was faster and stronger, catching her before she could reach the handle. His arms wrapped around her from behind, and she felt the same possessive grip that Laura had written about in her journal. Let me go. Sarah struggled against his hold, but his arms tightened around her chest. making it hard to breathe. "I can't do that," David said quietly in her ear. "You understand that, don't you? I can't let you leave any more than I could let Laura leave." Sarah thought about Laura's final journal entry, about her plan to pack a bag and go to her sister's house. She thought about the bruises on Laura's wrist, about David's declaration that a wife belonged with her husband. And she realized that she was about to become the second Mrs. Crawford to die for trying to leave. But unlike Laura, Sarah had one advantage. She knew what David was capable of. She had read Laura's words, seen the evidence of his possessive nature, understood the danger she was in. And she was not going to die in this house without a fight. Sarah went limp in David's arms, pretending to faint from shock and fear. When his grip loosened slightly in surprise, she drove her elbow back into his ribs with all the force she could muster. David grunted in pain and stumbled backward, giving her just enough room to break free and run. This time, she made it too, the back door and out into the October night, her bare feet hitting the cold grass as she ran toward the street, screaming for help with every breath in her lungs. Behind her, she could hear David pursuing, his heavier footsteps pounding against the ground. But Sarah was younger and more desperate, and fear gave her speed she didn't know she possessed. She reached the street just as a police cruiser turned the corner, its headlights sweeping across the front of their house. Sarah ran directly into the path of the car, waving her arms frantically as the officer hit his brakes and swerved to avoid hitting her. "Help me!" she screamed as Officer Martinez rolled down his window. "My husband killed his first wife. Her body is in our basement." David had stopped running when he saw the police car and now stood in their front yard, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender that was 33 years too late. The Lynn County Sheriff's Office had seen its share of dramatic cases over the decades, but the early morning arrest of David Crawford for the murder of his first wife created a buzz of activity that penetrated every corner of the building. Sarah sat in Sheriff Wilson's office, wrapped in a blanket that Deputy Martinez had retrieved from his patrol car, watching through the window as crime scene technicians prepared their equipment for what would likely be the most significant excavation in Cedar Rapids history. "Mrs. Crawford," Sheriff Wilson said gently, setting a cup of coffee in front of her, "I know this has been traumatic, but I need to ask you some questions while the details are still fresh in your mind." Sarah nodded, though her hands shook as she lifted the coffee cup. The warmth felt good against her palms, grounding her in the present moment when her mind kept trying to process the impossible reality of the past few hours. "Tell me about the box," Sheriff Wilson said, settling into his chair with a legal pad and pen. "How did you find it?" Sarah described her discovery in the attic, her research at the library, her growing suspicions about David's past. As she spoke, she watched Sheriff Wilson's expression change from professional interest to something approaching amazement. "You mean to tell me that evidence was sitting in that house for over 30 years, and we never found it?" It was hidden behind furniture, deliberately concealed. David said he spent 33 years making sure no one would find it. "Sheriff," Wilson shook his head slowly, "in all my years of law enforcement, I've never seen anything quite like this. A cold case solved by the perpetrator's own wife, using evidence he kept as souvenirs." "He said he kept Laura's things because he loved her," Sarah said, though the words felt wrong in her mouth. "But that's not love, is it? Love doesn't involve murder and 30 years of lies." "No, ma'am, it doesn't." Sheriff Wilson made notes on his pad. "Did David say anything else about what happened to Laura? Any details about the crime itself?" Sarah recounted David's confession as precisely as she could remember it, though some details seemed surreal, even as she spoke them. The idea that Laura had been in the basement all these years, that David had lived with her, remains directly beneath his feet, seemed like something from a horror movie rather than her actual life. "We'll need to verify his story," Sheriff Wilson said. "The crime scene team is already at your house with ground-penetrating radar and excavation equipment. If Laura's remains are where David says they are, we should have confirmation within a few hours. What happens to David now? He's being held without bail on suspicion of first-degree murder. His confession to you isn't admissible in court without corroborating evidence, but if we find Laura's body where he says it is, that should provide the physical evidence we need for prosecution." Sarah thought about the man she'd married, the gentle craftsman who made her coffee every morning, and reminded her to call the electrician about sparking outlets. It seemed impossible that the same hands that created beautiful cabinets had also killed a young woman and hidden her body for over 3 decades. "Mrs. Crawford," Sheriff Wilson said carefully, "I have to ask, did David ever show signs of violence or controlling behavior toward you?" Sarah considered the question. "No, never. He was always gentle, always considerate. That's part of what made this so shocking. But now that I know what to look for, I can see signs of possessiveness that I missed before. The way he discouraged me from asking about his past, his discomfort when I showed interest in genealogy or family history." "Abusers are often skilled at hiding their true nature," Sheriff Wilson said. "David Crawford managed to fool an entire community for over 30 years. The fact that he never harmed you suggests that you were never a threat to him until you discovered his secret." A knock on the office door interrupted their conversation. Deputy Clark entered with a grave expression and a manila folder in his hands. "Sheriff, we've got confirmation from the house. Ground-penetrating radar shows what appears to be human remains behind the basement wall, exactly where the suspect said they would be. Crime scene is preparing for excavation now." Sheriff Wilson closed his eyes briefly, as if processing the reality that a missing person case he'd worked on for decades was finally about to be resolved. "Any sign of the suspect changing his story?" "No, sir. He's being fully cooperative. Seems almost relieved to finally be telling the truth." After Deputy Clark left, Sheriff Wilson turned back to Sarah. "I'm afraid this is going to get very public. Very quickly. The media will want to interview you, and there'll be a lot of attention on this case once word gets out." "I understand," Sarah said, though the prospect of media attention made her stomach turn. "I just want to make sure Laura gets justice. Her family deserves to know what happened to her." "About that," Sheriff Wilson said, consulting his notes, "we've located Laura's sister in Ames, the one she was planning to visit when she died. Margaret Coleman Price. She's been waiting 33 years for answers about what happened to her sister." The thought of Laura's sister, living all these years with uncertainty and hope, brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "Will you tell her that Laura was trying to come to her for help? That she wasn't abandoning her family? She was trying to escape?" "Yes, ma'am. I think that will mean a great deal to her." Over the next several hours, Sarah watched from the sheriff's office as the investigation unfolded. Crime scene technicians carefully excavated the basement wall, working with the precision of archaeologists to preserve any evidence that might have survived 3 decades. By late afternoon, they had confirmed the presence of human remains and begun the delicate process of recovery. David, meanwhile, had provided a detailed written confession that corroborated every aspect of his verbal admission to Sarah. He showed investigators exactly where he had concealed Laura's body, described the improvised brick and concrete work he'd done to hide the crime scene, and even provided details about how he'd staged her disappearance. "It's almost like he wanted to be caught," Deputy Martinez observed, as he updated Sarah on the investigation's progress. Most criminals try to minimize their involvement, but Mr. Crawford is being completely forthcoming about everything. Sarah thought about the weight of carrying such a secret for over 30 years. Perhaps David had been waiting all this time for someone to discover the truth, to finally relieve him of the burden of his lies. As evening approached, Sheriff Wilson informed Sarah that she was free to go, but advised her not to return to the house while the crime scene investigation was ongoing. "Do you have somewhere you can stay?" he asked. Sarah realized she hadn't thought that far ahead. Her life in Cedar Rapids had revolved entirely around David and their shared home. She had casual friendships with neighbors and acquaintances, but no one close enough to impose upon during a crisis of this magnitude. "There's a hotel on the interstate," she said finally. "I'll stay there until I can figure out what to do next." Sheriff Wilson nodded sympathetically. "Mrs. Crawford, I want you to know that what you did took tremendous courage. You very well may have saved your own life by uncovering this evidence when you did." As Sarah drove to the hotel in her car, retrieved from the house by a deputy, she thought about Sheriff Wilson's words. Had David been planning to kill her? The memory of his arms around her, his quiet declaration that he couldn't let her leave, suggested that she had indeed been in mortal danger. But beyond her own safety, she had given Laura Marie Coleman something even more important: justice. After 33 years of silence, Laura's story would finally be told. Her family would finally have answers, and David Crawford would finally face the consequences of a crime he'd thought he'd committed perfectly. The Holiday Inn Express on Collins Road had seen better days, but it provided Sarah with the anonymity she desperately needed while Cedar Rapids buzzed with news of David Crawford's arrest. She'd checked in under her maiden name, Mitchell, and requested a room facing away from the parking lot to avoid any chance encounters with curious locals or persistent reporters. The beige walls and generic furniture felt like a safe cocoon. After the horror of the previous night, Sarah sat on the edge of the queen-sized bed, staring at her phone as it buzzed with incoming calls from numbers she didn't recognize. Word had leaked quickly about the discovery at 412 Maple Street, and somehow reporters had obtained her contact information. She'd stopped answering after the third call from someone claiming to represent a national news network. A soft knock on her hotel room door made her freeze. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the thought of facing another reporter made her stomach churn. But when she looked through the peephole, she saw a woman roughly her own age with auburn hair and kind eyes. That looked remarkably familiar. "Mrs. Crawford," the woman said when Sarah opened the door. "My name is Margaret Coleman Price. I was Laura's sister." Sarah felt her breath catch. The resemblance was unmistakable. This woman had the same delicate features and bright green eyes that had looked out from the wedding photograph in Laura's locked box. "Please, come in," Sarah said, stepping aside to let Margaret enter the room. "I'm so sorry for your loss. I know that sounds inadequate after all these years, but I truly am sorry." Margaret smiled sadly as she settled into the room's single chair. "Sheriff Wilson called me this morning. He told me what you discovered, how you figured out what happened to Laura." She paused, studying Sarah's face. "I wanted to thank you in person for giving my family closure after all these years." "I wish I could have found the truth sooner," Sarah said. "If I'd been more curious about David's past, if I'd pushed harder when things didn't add up." "You can't blame yourself for David's crimes," Margaret said firmly. "You were his victim too, in a different way. He deceived you for 3 years about the most fundamental aspects of his character." They sat in silence for a moment. Two women, connected by tragedy, and the man who had caused it. Finally, Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph. "I brought this for you," she said, handing Sarah a picture of Laura at what appeared to be a college graduation ceremony. Sheriff Wilson told me about Laura's journal, about how she was planning to come to my house when she died. I thought, you should know what kind of person she really was. In the photograph, Laura wore a cap and gown and beamed with joy and accomplishment. She looked young and full of hope, ready to take on the world with the confidence of someone who believed the future held nothing but possibilities. She was excited about her life, Margaret continued, about her job at the bank, about making her own way in the world. Laura was never the type to just disappear or run away from her problems. When she didn't show up at my house that week in June, I knew something terrible had happened. Did she call you before she died? Margaret nodded. You she was having problems with David? She called me the night before she disappeared. She was crying, which wasn't like Laura at all. She said David had been acting strange since the wedding, making comments about her job and her independence that scared her. She asked if she could stay with me for a while until she figured out what to do. What did you tell her? I told her to come immediately. I said I'd drive to Cedar Rapids to get her if necessary. But she said she needed to try talking to David one more time, that she owed him that much as his wife. Margaret's voice broke slightly. I begged her not to confront him alone, but she insisted she could handle it. She said she'd pack a bag and drive to my house the next day after work. Sarah thought about Laura's final journal entry about her determination to leave David despite her fear. It took courage to stand up to someone who had shown controlling and potentially violent tendencies, and Laura had paid for that courage with her life. Margaret, can I ask you something? Did Laura ever mention feeling like David was watching her or monitoring her activities? Actually, yes. During that last phone call, she said she'd found David going through her purse and her desk at home. When she asked him about it, he said he was just looking for a pen, but it made her uncomfortable. She also mentioned that he'd been asking a lot of questions about her work schedule and her friendships. Classic controlling behavior, Sarah realized. David had been tracking Laura's movements and associations, probably looking for signs that she might try to leave him. The revelation that she was planning to visit her sister must have triggered his most possessive instincts. Mrs. Crawford, Margaret said carefully, Sheriff Wilson told me that David kept Laura's personal belongings all these years. I was wondering, would it be possible for me to have some of those items back? Her jewelry, maybe, or her photographs? Of course, Sarah said immediately. I'll make sure you get everything. Those things belong to your family, not to David. Margaret smiled gratefully. There's one item in particular I'd like to have, if it's there. Laura wore a small gold locket that had belonged to our grandmother. She never took it off, so if David has it... Sarah remembered seeing jewelry in Laura's box, including what might have been a locket. The thought that David had kept such personal items as trophies made her feel sick all over again. They talked for another hour, with Margaret sharing stories about Laura's childhood, her dreams for the future, and the devastating impact her disappearance had on their family. Their parents had died within 2 years of each other in the early 2000s, both still hoping for answers about their missing daughter's fate. At least now they're all together, Margaret said as she prepared to leave. Laura, Mom, and Dad. And they finally know the truth. After Margaret left, Sarah found herself staring at the graduation photograph, thinking about the trajectory of Laura's life and how different it might have been if she'd never met David Crawford. Laura had been an intelligent, ambitious young woman with her whole future ahead of her. She deserved the chance to build the career and family she dreamed of, not to die at 22 because she'd married a man who couldn't accept that love didn't equal ownership. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Sheriff Wilson. Excavation complete. Laura's remains have been recovered and are being transported to the medical examiner's office. David has been formally charged with first-degree murder. Thought you should know. She set the phone aside and closed her eyes, trying to process the fact that Laura's 33-year nightmare was finally over. Her body would be returned to her family for a proper burial, and David would face justice for his crimes. But for Sarah, the nightmare was just beginning. She had to rebuild her entire life from scratch, starting with the fundamental question of who she was when she wasn't David Crawford's wife. Everything she'd believed about her marriage, her home, and her future had been based on lies. And now, she had to figure out how to move forward with nothing but the truth to guide her. The truth and the knowledge that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones most capable of destroying us. By Thursday morning, news vans lined Collins Road, outside the Holiday Inn Express, like a siege force waiting for Sarah to emerge. The story had broken nationally overnight. Iowa man confesses to wife's 33-year-old murder after new wife discovers evidence. And every major network seemed to want an exclusive interview with the woman who had solved one of Iowa's most enduring missing person cases. Sarah watched from behind the heavy curtains of her hotel room as reporters set up cameras and checked their equipment. She'd seen herself described in various news reports as everything from brave investigative wife to amateur sleuth who cracked cold case. But she didn't feel like any of those things. She felt like someone whose entire life had been revealed as an elaborate fiction and who now had to navigate the wreckage while the whole country watched. Her phone rang for what felt like the 100th time that morning. This time, however, the caller ID showed a familiar number. Sheriff Wilson. "Mrs. Crawford, I hope you're holding up okay," he said when she answered. "I know this media attention must be overwhelming." "I feel like a prisoner in here," Sarah admitted. "I can't leave my room without someone shoving a microphone in my face." "That's actually why I'm calling. We've arranged for you to give a single press conference this afternoon at the sheriff's office. Our thinking is that if you answer everyone's questions at once, the media attention might die down and give you some privacy to figure out your next steps." Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to face a room full of reporters, but the alternative, being ambushed every time she tried to leave her hotel room, seemed worse. What kind of questions will they ask? Probably about how you discovered the evidence, what made you suspicious, how you're coping with the revelation about your husband. I'll be there to redirect anything too personal or inappropriate. They'd scheduled the press conference for 2 p.m., which gave Sarah several hours to prepare. She spent the morning writing down key points she wanted to make, particularly about Laura Coleman, and the importance of giving her family closure after decades of uncertainty. At 1:30, Sheriff Wilson picked her up at a service entrance to the hotel, helping her avoid the reporters who were still camped out front. As they drove to the sheriff's office, Sarah watched the familiar streets of Cedar Rapids pass by and wondered if she would ever be able to see this town the same way again. Every corner held memories of her life with David, and now all of those memories were tainted by the knowledge of what he'd done. The sheriff's office had set up a small auditorium for the press conference, with a podium facing several rows of chairs filled with reporters, cameras, and recording equipment. Sarah felt her palms grow sweaty as Sheriff Wilson led her to the front of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sheriff Wilson began, "I'll make a brief statement about the case, and then Mrs. Crawford will answer your questions. Please keep in mind that Mrs. Crawford is a victim in this situation and deserves to be treated with respect and dignity." Sheriff Wilson provided a factual summary of the case: Laura Coleman's disappearance in 1992, the cold case investigation that had continued for decades, Sarah's discovery of evidence in the Crawford home, and David's subsequent confession and arrest. Then he introduced Sarah and stepped aside. The questions came fast and often overlapped. "Mrs. Crawford, what made you suspicious of your husband? How did it feel to discover you were married to a murderer? Did you ever fear for your own safety? What? Was it like finding evidence of another woman's murder in your own home?" Sarah took a deep breath and tried to answer thoughtfully. She described her innocent interest in family genealogy, her confusion about David's evasiveness regarding his past, and her shock at discovering Laura's existence. "I want to be very clear about something," Sarah said, looking directly into the cameras. "This story isn't about me being a hero or solving a mystery. This is about Laura Marie Coleman, a young woman who deserved to live her life and pursue her dreams. She was murdered by someone who claimed to love her, and her body was hidden for 33 years while her family suffered without answers. I'm grateful that I was able to help give her family closure, but Laura is the person we should be remembering today." One reporter asked about David's behavior during their marriage, whether there had been warning signs of his capacity for violence. "David was never violent with me," Sarah said carefully, "but I can see now that there were signs of controlling behavior that I didn't recognize at the time. I think it's important for people, especially women, to trust their instincts when something feels wrong in a relationship. If someone tries to isolate you from family and friends, if they discourage your independence or seem overly possessive, those are red flags that shouldn't be ignored." Another reporter wanted to know about her future plans. "Right now, I'm focused on cooperating with law enforcement to ensure that David faces justice for what he did to Laura. Beyond that, I'm taking things one day at a time." The press conference lasted about 45 minutes, and Sarah felt drained when it was over. But Sheriff Wilson seemed pleased with how it had gone. "You handled that very well," he said, as they left the building through a back exit. "You came across as genuine and sympathetic, and you kept the focus on Laura rather than on yourself. That should help with public perception." What happens now with David's case? The prosecutor will likely seek first-degree murder charges. With David's confession and the physical evidence we've recovered, it should be a straightforward case. He'll probably be advised to accept a plea agreement rather than go to trial. That evening, Sarah watched news coverage of the press conference from her hotel room. It was surreal seeing herself on television, discussing the collapse of her marriage and the discovery of a decades-old murder. The coverage was generally sympathetic, focusing on her courage in pursuing the truth despite the personal cost. But it was a brief interview with Margaret Coleman Price that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Laura's sister spoke eloquently about her family's long wait for answers and their gratitude to Sarah for finally providing them. "My sister was a vibrant, loving person who had so much to offer the world," Margaret said. "She deserved better than what happened to her. We're heartbroken that she's gone, but at least now we can lay her to rest with dignity and know that the person responsible will face justice." As the news coverage continued into the evening, Sarah found herself thinking about the different ways people respond to loss and trauma. David had responded to losing Laura by concealing his crime and rebuilding his life on a foundation of lies. Margaret and her family had responded by never giving up hope for answers, keeping Laura's memory alive through decades of uncertainty. And Sarah? She was still figuring out how she would respond to learning that her entire marriage had been built on deception. But she knew one thing for certain. She would not allow David's crimes to define the rest of her life the way they had defined his. Laura Coleman had been denied the chance to start over after discovering David's true nature. Sarah would not make the same mistake. She would find a way to build something genuine and honest from the ruins of her shattered life, and she would do it in a way that honored Laura's memory. The Lynn County Courthouse occupied an imposing limestone building in downtown Cedar Rapids that had witnessed decades of human drama played out in its courtrooms. Sarah sat in the gallery of Courtroom 3, watching as David Crawford shuffled in wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackles, his hands cuffed at his waist. It had been 2 weeks since his arrest, and the transformation was startling. The confident, methodical man she'd married looked smaller somehow, aged by more than just the passage of days. This was David's arraignment hearing, where he would officially enter a plea to the charges against him. District Attorney Rebecca Chen had filed first-degree murder charges, citing the premeditated nature of David's actions in concealing the crime and staging Laura's disappearance. If convicted, he faced life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sarah had wrestled with whether to attend the hearing. Part of her wanted to put as much distance as possible between herself and David, to begin the process of moving on with her life. But another part felt that she owed it to Laura to be present, to bear witness as the man who had killed her finally faced justice. David's court-appointed attorney, a tired-looking man named Robert Kellerman, had already indicated that his client would be pleading guilty to all charges. According to Sheriff Wilson, David had been cooperative with investigators throughout the process, providing detailed information about the crime and even helping them recover additional evidence from the house on Maple Street. Judge Patricia Harrison called the court to order, and the proceedings began with the formal reading of charges. Sarah watched David's face as the indictment was read aloud. 1 count of murder in the first degree, 1 count of abuse of a corpse, 1 count of tampering with evidence. His expression remained neutral, almost resigned, as if he were listening to charges against someone else. "Mr. Crawford," Judge Harrison said, "you have heard the charges against you. How do you plead?" David stood slowly, his shackles rattling softly in the quiet courtroom. "Guilty, Your Honor, to all charges." The words hung in the air like a final punctuation mark on 33 years of lies. Sarah felt a strange mix of relief and sadness wash over her. Relief that David would face consequences for his actions, sadness for the waste of so many lives. Laura's cut short, David's consumed by deception, her own built on false foundations. Judge Harrison scheduled a sentencing hearing for 6 weeks. Later, allowing time for the preparation of victim impact statements and psychological evaluations. As the court session ended and David was led away, he turned briefly toward the gallery. His eyes met Sarah's for just a moment, and she saw something there that might have been regret, or perhaps just exhaustion. Outside the courthouse, Sarah was approached by Margaret Coleman Price, who had driven from Ames to attend the hearing, with several other family members. "How are you holding up?" Margaret asked with genuine concern. "I'm okay," Sarah said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. It felt important to be here, to see him take responsibility for what he did. "It means a lot to our family that you came." Laura would have appreciated having someone speak for her. They walked together toward the courthouse parking garage, past a small group of reporters who kept a respectful distance. The media attention had decreased significantly since the press conference, though Sarah knew it would likely intensify, again around the sentencing hearing. "Margaret," Sarah said as they reached their cars, "I've been thinking about something. Would you and your family like to have a memorial service for Laura? Something to celebrate her life, rather than just mourn her death?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "That's a beautiful idea. We never had closure before, never had a chance to properly say goodbye. I think Laura would love that." Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into planning Laura's memorial service. It felt like something positive she could do with the terrible knowledge she'd gained, a way to honor the victim rather than just focus on the crime. She worked with Margaret and other family members to gather photographs, stories, and memories of Laura's life. The service was held at St. Matthew's Catholic Church, the same church where Laura and David had been married 33 years earlier. But this gathering was entirely different in tone and purpose. Instead of celebrating a beginning, they were honoring a life that had been cut tragically short. Margaret spoke about Laura's childhood dreams and academic achievements. Former colleagues from First National Bank shared memories of her professionalism and kindness. College friends described her excitement about starting her career and her optimism about the future. Sarah had debated whether to speak at the service, given her connection to David. But ultimately, she felt compelled to share what she'd learned about Laura's final days from reading her journal. Laura Coleman was brave, Sarah told the assembled group. In her final journal entry, she wrote about being scared, but still planning to leave a situation that had become dangerous. She was trying to protect herself and seek help from people who loved her. That took tremendous courage, and I think it's important that we remember her as someone who refused to accept abuse, even though speaking up ultimately cost her life. After the service, Laura's remains were finally laid to rest in Oak Hill Cemetery, in a plot beside her parents, who had died still hoping for answers about their daughter's fate. The headstone was simple but dignified. Laura Marie Coleman, beloved daughter and sister, 1970-1992. As the small group dispersed after the burial, Sarah found herself alone at the gravesite for a few minutes. She thought about the young woman whose possessions she'd discovered in a locked box, whose words she'd read in a secret journal, whose murder had destroyed her own faith in the man she'd married. "I'm sorry it took so long," Sarah whispered to the headstone. "But at least now everyone knows the truth." The wind rustled through the oak trees that gave the cemetery its name, and for a moment, Sarah felt something that might have been peace. Justice delayed was still justice, and Laura Coleman would finally be remembered for the person she had been, rather than just the mystery surrounding her disappearance. Now Sarah had to figure out how to rebuild her own life from the ashes of everything she'd believed to be true, but at least she would do it with honesty as her foundation, something David had never been able to offer either of his wives. The house on Maple Street stood empty now, its windows dark and its yard beginning to show signs of neglect. Sarah sat in her rental car across the street, gathering the courage to go inside one final time to collect her personal belongings. The crime scene tape had been removed weeks ago, but yellow stains on the siding marked where it had been attached, like scars that would fade but never completely disappear. She'd spent the past month living in a furnished apartment on the east side of Cedar Rapids, a temporary solution while she figured out what to do with the rest of her life. The apartment was clean and functional, but felt like a hotel room, a place to exist rather than live. Everything she'd built with David, from their shared home to their daily routines to their plans for the future, had been destroyed by the truth about Laura Coleman. The front door key still worked, though Sarah noticed her hand shaking as she turned it in the lock. The house felt different now, haunted by knowledge of what had happened within its walls. The basement, in particular, had been transformed from a storage area into something that felt like a crime scene, which it essentially was. Sarah moved quickly through the rooms, packing only the items that had belonged to her before her marriage: clothing, books, a few pieces of jewelry, and some photographs of her family. Everything else, the furniture they'd chosen together, the kitchen appliances they'd used to prepare countless meals, the decorations that had made the house feel like home, would be left behind. She wanted nothing that would remind her of her life with David. In their former bedroom, she paused at the closet where she'd hidden Laura's locked box for those few terrifying days when she'd known something was wrong, but hadn't understood how wrong. The space behind her winter coats looked ordinary now, just an empty corner of a walk-in closet. But Sarah would never forget the weight of that burgundy metal box or the secrets it had contained. As she packed the last of her belongings, Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed Margaret Coleman Price's number. "Hi, Margaret," Sarah answered. "How are you doing?" "We're getting by. Actually, I was calling because I have some news that might interest you. The family has decided to file a wrongful death lawsuit against David's estate. Our attorney says that even though David will likely die in prison, there might be assets we can recover for Laura's memory." Sarah thought about the house around her, the custom cabinetry business David had built, the investments and savings he'd accumulated over 33 years of freedom he hadn't deserved. "That seems appropriate," Sarah said. "David shouldn't be able to benefit financially from his crimes. Our attorney also mentioned that you might have a claim as an innocent spouse who was defrauded. Apparently, there are legal protections for people who unknowingly married someone concealing a serious crime." The idea hadn't occurred to Sarah, but it made sense. She'd entered into marriage with David based on false information about his character and history. In legal terms, that could constitute fraud sufficient to void their marriage and potentially recover damages. "I'll think about it," Sarah said. "Right now, I'm just focused on moving forward." After finishing at the house, Sarah drove to one final appointment, a meeting with a real estate agent to discuss putting the property on the market. Patricia Wong had handled the sale of Sarah's Chicago condo 3 years earlier and had agreed to help with this much more complicated transaction. Given the notoriety of the case, Patricia explained as they sat in her office, "We'll need to be upfront about the property's history. Iowa law requires disclosure of any death that occurred on the premises, and this situation obviously goes well beyond that requirement. Will anyone want to buy it? You'd be surprised. Some buyers are drawn to properties with historical significance, even dark history. And the house itself is well maintained and in a desirable neighborhood. We might need to price it below market value, but I think we can find a buyer." Sarah signed the listing papers with a sense of finality. Selling the house would sever her last connection to David and their shared life. With the proceeds, she could start completely fresh somewhere new, without the constant reminders of how thoroughly she'd been deceived. That evening, she called her sister in California, the first time they'd spoken since the news broke about. "David's arrest. Sarah, I've been so worried about you," Linda said. "Are you really okay? I mean, finding out something like that about your husband." "I'm getting through it," Sarah said. "Some days are harder than others, but I'm starting to see it as an opportunity rather than just a tragedy." An opportunity? To build a life based on truth instead of lies, to make choices for the right reasons instead of just accepting what someone else tells me is right. Sarah paused, looking out the window of her temporary apartment at the lights of Cedar Rapids. "I spent 3 years with a man who was capable of murder, and I never saw it. That's taught me a lot about trusting my instincts and asking the right questions. Have you thought about moving back to Chicago? You could stay with me until you find your own place." Sarah had considered it, but returning to her old life felt like stepping backward rather than forward. "I think I need to go somewhere completely new, maybe the West Coast or New England. Somewhere I can practice law again without everyone knowing my story." They talked for another hour, with Linda sharing news about her job and her kids, normal family conversation that felt like a lifeline to Sarah. It reminded her that there was a world beyond Cedar Rapids where her identity wasn't defined by being the woman who discovered her husband was a murderer. After hanging up, Sarah opened her laptop and began researching law firms in cities she'd never visited: Portland, Oregon, Burlington, Vermont, Asheville, North Carolina. Places where she could start over with nothing but her own capabilities and the hard-won knowledge that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. The locked box that had destroyed her marriage had also liberated her from a relationship built on deception. Laura Coleman had paid with her life for trying to escape David's control. But Sarah had been given a second chance to build something honest and authentic. She owed it to Laura's memory and to her own future to make the most of that opportunity. Chukitiyu courthouse was packed for David Crawford's sentencing hearing, with representatives from local and national media filling the back rows of Courtroom 3. Sarah sat in the front row of the gallery, flanked by Margaret Coleman Price and several other members of Laura's family. The past 6 weeks had given everyone time to process the guilty plea and prepare for this final chapter in a case that had captivated the community. Judge Patricia Harrison entered precisely at 9 a.m., her black robes adding gravity to proceedings. That would determine how David Crawford would spend the remainder of his life. David sat at the defendant's table beside his attorney, wearing a pressed gray suit that made him look more like the respected craftsman he'd pretended to be than the convicted murderer he actually was. We're here today for sentencing in the matter of State of Iowa versus David James Crawford, Judge Harrison announced. Before I impose sentence, I'll hear victim impact statements from the family of Laura Marie Coleman. Margaret was the first to speak, approaching the podium with a composure that Sarah found remarkable given the circumstances. Her statement was thoughtful and measured, focusing more on Laura's lost potential than on anger toward David. Your Honor, my sister Laura was 22 years old when she was murdered. She had a college degree, a promising career, and dreams of building a family of her own. She was excited about life and optimistic about the future. David Crawford didn't just take her life, he stole 33 years of possibilities, experiences, and relationships that we'll never have with her. Margaret's voice wavered slightly as she continued. Our parents died without ever knowing what happened to their daughter. They spent their final years hoping she was alive somewhere, maybe with amnesia or starting a new life. In some ways, that false hope was worse than the truth would have been. She turned to look directly at David. Mr. Crawford, I want you to know that Laura was planning to ask for a divorce. She was scared of you, but she was brave enough to try, to leave. She deserved the chance to escape and build a better life. Your decision to kill her rather than let her go shows a selfishness that's almost impossible to comprehend. When Margaret returned to her seat, Judge Harrison asked if there were any other victim impact statements. Sarah had debated whether to speak, since she was technically a victim of David's deception rather than his violence, but she felt compelled to address the broader implications of his crimes. Your Honor, I'm Sarah Mitchell, she said, deliberately using her maiden name. I was married to David Crawford for 3 years, though I now understand that marriage was based on lies and deception. Sarah had prepared extensive remarks, but standing at the podium, she found herself speaking from the heart instead. I want to say something about the nature of David's crimes. This wasn't a moment of passion or a crime of opportunity. This was a calculated decision to murder his wife rather than allow her to exercise her fundamental right to leave an unhappy marriage. Then he spent 33 years living a lie, building relationships, and presenting himself as a pillar of the community while Laura's body lay hidden in his basement. She paused, gathering her thoughts. David's actions harmed more than just Laura and her family. They harmed everyone who trusted him. everyone who considered him a friend, everyone who believed in the person he pretended to be. His crime created ripple effects that touched dozens of lives across 3 decades. Sarah looked toward David, who was staring at his hands. But perhaps most importantly, David's decision to conceal his crime denied Laura's family the opportunity to grieve properly, and denied Laura herself the dignity of a proper burial. That compound crime, murder followed by decades of deception, deserves the harshest possible punishment. After the victim impact statements, District Attorney Rebecca Chen presented her sentencing recommendation. She argued for life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, citing the premeditated nature of the crime, the elaborate cover-up, and David's decades of deception. David's attorney, Robert Kellerman, made a brief plea for mercy, citing his client's cooperation with the investigation and his expression of remorse. But it was clear that even Kellerman recognized the futility of arguing for leniency in such a case. Judge Harrison asked David if he wished to make a statement before sentencing. David stood slowly, cleared his throat, and spoke in a voice so quiet that people in the gallery strained to hear him. "I want to apologize to Laura's family for the pain I've caused. I loved Laura, but I loved her in a selfish way that couldn't accept her independence. When she said she wanted to leave, I should have let her go. Instead, I let my fear of losing her drive me to do something unforgivable." He paused, seemingly struggling with his words. "I also want to apologize to Sarah, who deserved better than to be married to someone carrying such a terrible secret. And I want to apologize to this community, which trusted me and welcomed me despite what I had done." David's voice grew even quieter. "I know that no apology can undo the harm I've caused. I know that Laura's family has suffered for 33 years because of my actions. I know that I destroyed multiple lives through my selfishness and cowardice. I accept full responsibility for my crimes, and I accept whatever punishment this court deems appropriate." Judge Harrison took a brief recess to consider her ruling, returning 20 minutes later with a decision that surprised no one. "Mr. Crawford, you have pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with evidence. These crimes show a callous disregard for human life and a calculated willingness to deceive your community for over 3 decades." She continued, "The court finds that your actions warrant the maximum penalty allowed by law. You are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole on the murder charge, with additional concurrent sentences for the other charges. You will be remanded to the custody of the Iowa Department of Corrections immediately." Court officers approached to escort David from the courtroom. He turned once more toward the gallery. His eyes found Sarah's, and she saw in them something that might have been gratitude, perhaps relief that his decades of deception were finally over. Outside the courthouse, Sarah was approached by reporters wanting her reaction to the sentencing. She kept her comments brief. "Justice has been served for Laura Coleman," she said. "Now her family can finally have some peace, and our community can begin to heal from the deception that has poisoned it for so many years." As the crowd dispersed, Margaret Coleman Price pulled Sarah aside. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything. For finding the truth, for giving Laura a voice, for helping us get justice." Sarah hugged Margaret goodbye, knowing that while their shared tragedy had brought them together, they would probably not see each other again. Margaret could return to Ames and begin the process of truly mourning her sister, while Sarah could begin the process of rebuilding her life on a foundation of truth rather than lies. The sentencing marked the end of David Crawford's freedom and the beginning of Sarah's. 3 months after David's sentencing, Sarah stood on the deck of a small cottage overlooking the Pacific Ocean in Mendocino, California, watching the sun set over waves that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The cottage was her new home, at least temporarily, while she studied for the California bar exam and prepared to restart her legal career. The isolation felt healing after the intense scrutiny she'd faced in Cedar Rapids. The house on Maple Street had sold in January to a young couple from Minneapolis who viewed its notoriety as an interesting historical footnote rather than a deterrent. After legal fees and debts, the sale had left Sarah with enough money to make a fresh start anywhere she chose. She'd picked Mendocino partly for its remote beauty, and partly because no one there knew her story. Her days had fallen into a comfortable routine. Mornings were devoted to bar exam preparation, afternoons to long walks along the coastal bluffs, and evenings to reading and correspondence. She'd been in touch with Margaret Coleman Price regularly, following the progress of the wrongful death lawsuit and sharing updates about their respective healing processes. The legal case against David's estate was progressing slowly but favorably. His assets, including the cabinetry business and various investments, would likely provide significant compensation to Laura's family. Sarah had decided not to pursue her own fraud claim, preferring to focus on moving forward rather than continuing to seek remedies for David's deception. On this particular evening, Sarah was expecting a visitor. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery, was driving up from San Francisco for what had become a monthly consultation. Sarah had initially resisted the idea of therapy, but Margaret had convinced her that processing the psychological impact of David's betrayal was as important as dealing with the practical consequences. Dr. Rodriguez arrived as the last light was fading from the sky, carrying a bottle of wine and the warm smile that had made their sessions feel more like conversations with a wise friend than clinical appointments. "How are you feeling about going back to work?" Dr. Rodriguez asked as they settled onto the deck with glasses of wine. Sarah had recently accepted a position with a small environmental law firm in Eureka, about 2 hours north of Mendocino. It would be her first return to legal practice since discovering David's crimes, and she felt both excited and nervous about resuming her career. "I'm ready," Sarah said. "I've spent enough time focusing on what happened to me. I want to start focusing on what I can make happen next." That's a healthy perspective. But remember that healing isn't linear. You might have difficult days even after you feel like you've moved on. They talked about Sarah's progress over the past few months, her growing ability to trust her own instincts, her decreasing anxiety about being alone, her renewed sense of purpose. The conversation drifted to broader topics: the nature of deception in relationships, the process of rebuilding identity after trauma, the difference between forgiveness and acceptance. "Do you think you'll ever forgive David?" Dr. Rodriguez asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. "I don't think forgiveness is the right word. I understand that he was damaged in ways that led to his crimes, and I don't carry anger toward him anymore. But what he did to Laura was unforgivable. I can accept that it happened and move on with my life, but I can't forgive the deliberate choice to kill someone rather than let them leave." "What about forgiving yourself for not seeing the signs?" "That's been harder," Sarah admitted. "I've had to accept that David was skilled at deception, that he'd had 33 years to perfect his false persona. But I've also learned to trust my instincts more, to pay attention when something feels wrong even if I can't explain why." Dr. Rodriguez smiled. "That's one of the most valuable lessons anyone can learn, regardless of their circumstances." After Dr. Rodriguez left, Sarah remained on the deck, listening to the waves crash against the rocks below. She thought about The journey that had brought her to this moment, from happily married woman to crime solver to survivor rebuilding her life on her own terms. Tomorrow, she would begin packing for her move to Eureka and her new job. Next week, she would start helping clients with environmental protection cases, using her legal skills to make a positive difference in the world. It felt like a fitting way to honor Laura's memory by using the second chance she'd been given to do meaningful work. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret. Saw the news story about the cottage industry of murder house tours starting in Cedar Rapids. Ugh. But also saw your quote about preferring to focus on the future rather than the past. Proud of you. Sarah smiled and typed back. The past informs the present, but doesn't define the future. Laura taught me that through her journal. She was trying to change her situation right up until the end. I can do the same. As the stars became visible in the clear coastal sky, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Excitement about what tomorrow might bring. The locked box that had ended her marriage had also unlocked possibilities she'd never imagined. She was free to become whoever she chose to be, guided by truth instead of deception, strength instead of fear. Laura Coleman had been denied the chance to start over after recognizing David's true nature, but Sarah had been given that opportunity, and she intended to make the most of it. Not just for herself, but as a testament to the courage of a young woman who had tried to save herself and, in the process, had ultimately saved someone else. The wind off the Pacific carried the scent of salt and possibility, and Sarah breathed it in deeply, ready for whatever came next. 6 months into her new position at Coastal Environmental Law, Sarah stood before a packed Eureka City Council meeting, presenting arguments against a proposed development that would have damaged critical wetlands habitat. The case had consumed her attention for weeks, requiring the kind of focused research and legal analysis that reminded her why she'd loved practicing law in the first place. The environmental impact assessment submitted by the developer fails to account for the cumulative effects of habitat fragmentation, Sarah told the council members, using a laser pointer to highlight key areas on a map projection. The proposed shopping center would eliminate crucial nesting sites for endangered bird species and disrupt migration patterns that have existed for thousands of years. She felt completely in her element, advocating for clients who couldn't speak for themselves. Wildlife and ecosystems threatened by poorly planned development. It was meaningful work that felt like a form of redemption after the meaningless years she'd spent building a life with a man who'd murdered his first wife. After the council voted unanimously to reject the development proposal, Sarah was approached by several environmental activists who'd attended the meeting. Among them was Jake Morrison, a marine biologist who worked with the local aquarium and had become a regular collaborator on cases involving coastal protection. "Outstanding presentation," Jake said with the easy smile that had become familiar over their months of working together. "You made that look effortless, but I know how much research went into those arguments." Sarah felt a flutter of attraction that both pleased and worried her. Jake was intelligent, passionate about his work, and genuinely kind, qualities that reminded her why she'd initially been drawn to David. But the comparison also triggered the wariness that had become her constant companion since discovering David's true nature. "Would you like to grab dinner to celebrate?" Jake asked. "I know a place that serves amazing locally caught salmon." Sarah hesitated. They'd shared several professional lunches over the past few months, but they'd always maintained strictly professional boundaries. A dinner invitation felt like it might cross into personal territory that Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to navigate. "I'd like that," she heard herself say, surprising them both. "But just as friends celebrating a good outcome for the wetlands," Jake's smile widened. "Absolutely. Friends protecting the environment one lawsuit at a time. They drove separately to Neptune's Table, a small restaurant overlooking Humboldt Bay, where the day's fresh catch was served simply but expertly prepared. As they waited for their meals, Sarah found herself genuinely relaxing for the first time. In months, Jake was easy to talk to, passionate about marine conservation, and refreshingly honest in his opinions about everything from local politics to his failed attempts at growing organic vegetables. "Can I ask you something personal?" Jake said, as they shared a dessert of local blackberry cobbler. Sarah tensed slightly. "Depends on how personal." "I've never asked about your past, but I get the sense that you're starting over here in California. Professionally, I mean. You're clearly experienced and skilled, but there's something about the way you approach new situations that suggests you're rebuilding rather than just relocating." Sarah appreciated his tactful way of acknowledging that he'd sensed there was more to her story without prying for details. She'd been dreading this conversation, but realized it was inevitable if she wanted to build genuine friendships in her new life. "I was married before," she said carefully. "It ended badly, and I needed a fresh start somewhere completely different." Jake nodded without pushing for more information. "Well, California's gain is wherever you came from's loss. You're making a real difference here." The conversation moved on to lighter topics, but Sarah found herself evaluating Jake's responses to her carefully chosen words. Unlike David, who had deflected or changed the subject whenever personal topics arose, Jake seemed comfortable with the natural ebb and flow of getting to know someone. He shared stories about his own past, a brief marriage in graduate school that had ended amicably when both parties realized they wanted different things from life. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Jake mentioned that he was planning a weekend research trip to the Farallon Islands to study seal populations. "You should come along if you're interested," he said. "It's not exactly luxury travel. We'll be camping and collecting data, but the islands are incredibly beautiful and completely untouched by development." Sarah found herself tempted by the invitation, then immediately suspicious of her own reaction. Was she attracted to Jake because he was genuinely appealing, or because she was lonely and grateful for male attention that didn't come with hidden agendas? "Let me think about it," she said. "I'm still getting used to having weekends that aren't consumed by work." Driving home to her cottage in Mendocino, Sarah reflected on the evening. For a few hours, she'd felt like a normal person having dinner with a colleague who might become a friend. She hadn't been David Crawford's widow, or the woman who'd solved a 33-year-old murder case. She'd just been Sarah Mitchell, environmental lawyer and defender of wetlands. But even as she enjoyed that feeling of normalcy, she remained hyper-aware of her own responses to Jake's kindness. Dr. Rodriguez had warned her that trauma survivors often struggled with trusting their judgment about new relationships. The very qualities that had initially attracted her to David, his stability, his apparent devotion, his integration into community life, had all been facades concealing something much darker. How could she trust her instincts about Jake when her instincts had been so catastrophically wrong about David? Back at the cottage, Sarah called Margaret Coleman Price, who had become both a friend and a sounding board during her healing process. "I had dinner with a colleague tonight," Sarah said without preamble when Margaret answered. "Just dinner, or dinner? Dinner?" Margaret asked with a knowing tone. Dinner, I think." "Maybe. He asked me to go on a research trip with him next weekend. And you're terrified because he seems nice and normal, and you don't trust your ability to judge men anymore." Sarah laughed despite herself. "You know me too well." "Sarah, you can't let David's crimes poison every future relationship. Yes, you need to be careful and trust your instincts. But you also need to remember that most people aren't sociopaths who've been hiding murders for 33 years. How do I tell the difference?" By taking your time, asking questions, and paying attention to how someone treats not just you, but everyone around them. Watch how Jake interacts with servers, with people who can't do anything for him professionally, with animals and children if you get the chance. David was able to fool you because you only saw him in controlled circumstances, where he could manage his image. Margaret's advice made sense, but Sarah still felt overwhelmed by the prospect of dating again. The stakes felt impossibly high when she knew what monsters could hide behind charming facades. "Maybe I'm not ready for this," Sarah said. "Maybe you're not," Margaret agreed. "And that's okay too. But don't let David's evil rob you of the possibility of happiness with someone who deserves your trust." Laura would want you to be open to love again, even if it takes time to feel safe doing so. After hanging up, Sarah sat on her deck listening to the waves and thinking about Laura's courage in planning to leave David despite her fear. Laura had been willing to risk everything for the chance at a better life, even though that courage had ultimately cost her everything. Sarah owed it to Laura's memory and to her own future to be equally brave when the time was right. But she also owed it to herself to move slowly and carefully, building new relationships on foundations of honesty rather than desperation or loneliness. Jake Morrison might be everything he appeared to be: kind, intelligent, genuinely interested in making the world better. Or he might be skilled at presenting a false image, just as David had been. Only time and careful observation would tell the difference. But for the first time since discovering David's crimes, Sarah felt ready to find out. 2 weeks later, Sarah found herself on a research vessel heading toward the Farallon Islands, watching Jake Morrison work with a team of marine biology graduate students. She'd ultimately decided to accept his invitation, partly because she was genuinely interested in the research, and partly because she wanted to observe him in an uncontrolled environment where his true character might emerge. The 3-day trip would involve camping on southeast Farallon Island while collecting data on elephant seal populations, monitoring seabird colonies, and documenting the effects of climate change on marine ecosystems. It was exactly the kind of meaningful work that reminded Sarah why she'd chosen environmental law as her specialty. But it was also an opportunity to see how Jake interacted with people when he wasn't trying to impress anyone. How he treated the graduate students under his supervision, how he responded to the inevitable frustrations of field research, how he handled discomfort and inconvenience. Dr. Rodriguez had suggested this kind of behavioral observation as a way for Sarah to rebuild confidence in her ability to judge character. "Watch how people behave when they think no one important is watching," she'd advised. "That's when you see who they really are." The first day of research went smoothly, with Jake proving to be a patient and encouraging mentor to his students. Sarah watched him help a nervous undergraduate named Jessica overcome her fear of approaching massive elephant seals, offering gentle guidance and practical safety tips without making her feel incompetent. "The key is to move slowly and respect their space," Jake explained as they observed a group of seals hauled out on the rocks. "They're wild animals, not zoo exhibits, and they deserve our respect while we're studying them." Sarah noted how Jake consistently put the welfare of the animals above the convenience of the research team, insisting on maintaining safe distances even when it made data collection more challenging. It was a small thing, but it suggested genuine empathy rather than the performative concern that someone like David might have displayed. That evening, as the group sat around a camp stove sharing a simple dinner of pasta and canned sauce, conversation turned to personal motivations for choosing marine biology as a career. Sarah listened as Jake talked about a childhood spent exploring tide pools with his grandfather, his devastation when he'd witnessed an oil spill on the California coast, During college, his belief that scientific research was a form of activism. "I know it sounds idealistic," Jake said, stirring the pasta with a plastic spoon, "but I really believe that understanding these ecosystems is the first step toward protecting them. Every study we do, every paper we publish, every lawsuit Sarah files, it all adds up to something that might make a difference for future generations." His passion seemed genuine, and Sarah found herself drawn to his combination of scientific rigor and emotional investment in his work. But she also remained alert for any signs of the controlling behavior that had characterized David's hidden nature. Those signs didn't emerge. When one of the graduate students accidentally knocked over a container of samples they'd spent hours collecting, Jake's response was to help clean up the mess and reassure the student that mistakes happened to everyone. When equipment malfunctioned and threatened to derail an important data collection session, he worked collaboratively with the team to find solutions rather than taking charge or assigning blame. "You're really good with the students," Sarah observed as they walked along the shoreline after dinner, checking monitoring equipment they'd placed earlier in the day. "They remind me of myself at that age," Jake said, "passionate but terrified of screwing up. I had mentors who were patient with me, and I try to pay that forward." Sarah thought about David's approach to mentoring the younger carpenters who'd worked for him over the years. He'd been competent and fair, but also somewhat distant and controlling. Jake's more collaborative style felt healthier, more respectful of other people's autonomy and learning processes. On the second day, the group encountered unexpected challenges when a storm system moved in faster than predicted, creating dangerous conditions for their planned boat surveys. Jake made the decision to modify their research plans, prioritizing safety over data collection in a way that impressed Sarah with his judgment under pressure. "The seals will still be here next month," he said, when one of the graduate students expressed disappointment about the shortened trip. Data isn't worth anyone getting hurt. As they huddled in their tents that night, listening to wind and rain batter the island, Sarah found herself thinking about the difference between Jake's leadership style and David's need for control. Jake made decisions based on what was best for the group. David had made decisions based on what was best for him, regardless of the cost to others. The storm cleared by morning, revealing a transformed landscape where the previous day's research sites were now underwater or inaccessible. Instead of frustration, Jake showed excitement about the opportunity to document storm impacts on the island ecosystem. "This is actually incredible data," he told the group as they surveyed the changes. "We're seeing real-time evidence of how these systems adapt to sudden environmental changes." His ability to find opportunity in adversity reminded Sarah of qualities she admired in herself: resilience, adaptability, the ability to reframe challenges as learning experiences. It was refreshing to be around someone who shared those characteristics, rather than someone who responded to disappointment with anger or blame. On the final evening, as they prepared to leave the island the next morning, Jake and Sarah found themselves alone while the students worked on cataloging their samples. They sat on the rocks watching the sunset, the endless Pacific stretching toward the horizon. "Can I ask you something?" Jake said quietly. Sarah tensed, wondering if he was about to probe into her past the way reporters had done in the months after David's arrest. "You mentioned that your previous marriage ended badly," Jake continued. "I don't need details, but I want you to know that I understand if you need to take things slowly. Building trust after being hurt takes time." His consideration touched her deeply. Unlike David, who had pushed for commitment and exclusivity almost immediately, Jake seemed content to let their relationship develop at whatever pace felt comfortable for her. "Thank you for saying that," Sarah said. "I'm still figuring out how to trust my judgment about people." "Maybe we can figure it out together," Jake suggested. "No pressure, no expectations. just two people who care about protecting the environment and getting to know each other. As they prepared to leave the Farallon Islands the next morning, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in over a year: optimism about the possibility of a healthy romantic relationship. Jake had passed every test her traumatized psyche had devised, showing consistent kindness, respect for boundaries, and genuine care for others. But more importantly, she was beginning to trust her own ability to recognize these positive qualities and distinguish them from the superficial charm that had masked David's true nature. The healing process was far from complete, but Sarah was finally ready to believe that her future could include love based on honesty rather than deception. Laura Coleman had been denied the chance to escape an unhealthy relationship and find something better. Sarah was determined not to waste the opportunity that Laura's tragic story had ultimately provided. 1 year after David Crawford's sentencing, Sarah received a phone call that transported her back to the world she'd been trying to leave behind. Sheriff Wilson's voice on the line was professional, but tinged with an excitement she hadn't heard since the night of David's arrest. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, using the name she'd legally reclaimed 6 months earlier, "I have some news about the Crawford case that I thought you'd want to hear personally." Sarah was in her new home office in Eureka, where she'd recently hung her California bar certificate alongside commendations from environmental organizations whose cases she'd won. Jake's research photographs from their Farallon Islands trip decorated one wall, and her desk faced a window overlooking Humboldt Bay, where otters often played in the kelp beds. "What kind of news?" Sarah asked, though part of her didn't want to know. She'd worked hard to build a life that wasn't defined by David's crimes. "We've reopened several other missing person cases from the 1980s and 1990s, Sheriff Wilson explained. David's confession got us thinking about other unsolved disappearances during that time period, particularly young women who might have been romantically involved with him. Sarah felt her stomach drop. "You think David killed other people?" "We don't know yet. But during his debriefing sessions, David mentioned having serious relationships with 2 other women before Laura that ended when the women moved away suddenly. When we checked their missing person files, the circumstances were remarkably similar to Laura's case. The implications were staggering. If David had killed multiple women over the years, Laura's murder hadn't been an isolated incident triggered by the stress of marriage. It would mean David was a serial killer who had used Cedar Rapids as his hunting ground for decades. Have you confronted David with this information? His attorney won't let him talk to us anymore. Claims his client has said everything he's going to say. But we're using ground-penetrating radar on other properties David had access to over the key. Years, his parents' house, the business warehouse, a cabin his family owned up in Dubuque County. Sarah thought about the methodical, organized man she'd married, the one who planned every aspect of his life with precision and care. If he had killed multiple women, he would have chosen burial sites carefully, probably places where he could monitor them and ensure they remained undisturbed. "Sheriff, can I ask you something? In your professional opinion, do you think David is capable of serial murder?" Sheriff Wilson was quiet for a moment. "Off the record, yes. David Crawford is one of the most controlled, calculating individuals I've encountered in 30 years of law enforcement. His ability to compartmentalize his crimes while maintaining a normal social facade suggests a level of psychological sophistication that's consistent with serial offenders." After hanging up, Sarah sat in her office staring out at the bay, trying to process the possibility that she'd been married to someone even more dangerous than she'd imagined. She'd thought David's crime was possessive rage taken to an extreme. Conclusion. The idea that Laura might have been one of multiple victims suggested something much more sinister. a predatory pattern that had operated under cover of small-town respectability for decades. She called Jake, who was conducting fieldwork at Point Reyes, but answered on the first ring. "They think David might have killed other women," she said without preamble. Jake was quiet for a moment, then said simply, "Are you okay?" "I don't know. I thought I'd moved past all this." But hearing that Laura might not have been his only victim, Sarah's voice trailed off. "Do you want me to come home? I can be there in a few hours." The offer touched her deeply. Over the past 6 months, Jake had become her closest confidant and strongest source of support, but he'd never pushed for more than she was ready to give. Their relationship had developed slowly and carefully, built on shared interests and genuine friendship as much as romantic attraction. "No, stay and finish your research, but thank you for offering." "Sarah, whatever they discover about David's past doesn't change who you are now. You saved yourself and potentially other women by uncovering the truth about Laura. That's something to be proud of, not ashamed of." Over the following weeks, news broke that investigators had indeed discovered additional remains on properties connected to David Crawford. The first discovery came at his parents' former home, where ground-penetrating radar revealed what appeared to be human remains buried beneath a concrete patio that David had poured in 1987. The second discovery was at a remote cabin in Dubuque County that had belonged to David's grandfather. Searchers found the remains of 2 women buried in the woods behind the cabin, along with personal items that matched missing person reports from 1989 and 1993. DNA testing would take months to confirm the identities of the victims, but cold case. Investigators were already comparing David's known whereabouts with unsolved disappearances throughout Iowa and neighboring states. The scope of his potential crimes was still emerging, but it appeared that David Crawford had been killing women for at least a decade before he met Laura. Sarah followed the news coverage with a mixture of horror and vindication. Horror at the Ibarsu scale of David's crimes, vindication that her instincts about his capacity for deception had been accurate even if she'd underestimated the true extent of his evil. Margaret Coleman Price called after the third set of remains was discovered. "I keep thinking about what you said at Laura's memorial service," Margaret said, "about how brave she was for trying to leave, knowing now that David had killed before, that Laura might have been walking into the den of an experienced killer. It makes her courage even more remarkable. It also makes her death even more tragic," Sarah replied. "She was so close to escaping. But her story is what ultimately stopped him. If you hadn't found that locked box, if you hadn't been brave enough to investigate despite the personal cost, David might still be out there. Other women might have died." Margaret's words provided perspective that Sarah desperately needed. That locked box that had destroyed her marriage had also prevented future crimes. Laura's journal, with its documentation of David's controlling behavior, had provided the evidence needed to expose a killer who might otherwise have continued operating indefinitely. 3 months later, David Crawford was charged with 4 additional counts of first-degree murder. He declined to provide any information about the newly discovered victims, maintaining through his attorney that he would not participate in any further questioning or cooperation with authorities. Sarah was not surprised by his silence. Having created a confession that exposed his crimes with Laura, David had apparently decided he'd said enough. The methodical, controlling man she'd married would want to maintain some sense of power over the narrative, even from his prison cell. The final chapter of David's legal proceedings concluded with a plea agreement that sentenced him to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. He would die in prison, as he deserved, having been exposed as one of Iowa's most prolific serial killers. But for Sarah, the conclusion of David's legal saga was less important than her own continued healing and growth. She'd built a meaningful career, developed a healthy relationship with Jake, and created a life based on truth rather than deception. Standing on her deck in Mendocino as news broke of David's final sentencing, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. A locked box hidden in an attic had destroyed everything she'd thought she knew about her life, but it had also freed her to become the person she was meant to be. Laura Coleman and the other victims would never have that opportunity, but their stories, preserved in evidence and testimony, would ensure that David Crawford's crimes were remembered and that their lives had meaning beyond the violence that ended them. Justice for the dead, hope for the living. It was the best outcome Sarah could have asked for from such a tragic beginning. 2 years after David Crawford received his final life sentences, Sarah stood before a packed auditorium at the University of California, Davis, delivering the keynote address at a conference on domestic violence prevention. The invitation had come through her work with environmental law, but conference organizers had learned about her personal experience with intimate partner deception and requested that she share her insights about recognizing dangerous relationships. Sarah had initially declined, preferring to keep her advocacy work separate from her personal trauma. But after consulting with Dr. Rodriguez and reflecting on the number of women who might benefit from hearing her story, she'd agreed to speak about the intersection between environmental justice and personal safety, how both required vigilance, education, and the courage to trust one's instincts even when others dismissed concerns. Environmental protection and personal protection share many of the same principles, Sarah told the audience of researchers, activists, and survivors. Both require us to pay attention to warning signs that others might dismiss as normal variations. Both demand that we trust scientific evidence over public relations campaigns designed to make harmful practices seem acceptable. She spoke about the parallels between corporate gaslighting, where companies denied environmental damage despite clear evidence, and intimate partner manipulation, where abusers minimized or denied their harmful behavior while gradually increasing control over their victims. In my environmental law practice, I've learned that the most dangerous polluters are often those who present themselves as responsible corporate citizens, Sarah continued. They fund community organizations, sponsor local events, and create carefully managed public images that make it difficult for people to believe they could be causing serious harm behind the scenes. The audience was completely quiet, hanging on every word as Sarah drew connections between her professional expertise and her personal experience. Similarly, the most dangerous intimate partners are often those who seem like ideal spouses, parents, and community members. They're skilled at compartmentalizing their behavior, showing charm and consideration in public, while exercising control and manipulation in private. Sarah shared some details about David's deception without sensationalizing the violence or exploiting Laura's memory. She focused instead on the warning signs she'd missed and the lessons that might help others recognize similar patterns before they became dangerous. After her presentation, Sarah was approached by dozens of conference attendees, researchers, wanting to collaborate on projects that address the connections between environmental and personal safety, advocates seeking resources for clients dealing with complex abuse situations, and survivors sharing their own stories of escaping dangerous relationships. One woman, an environmental scientist named Dr. Patricia Chen, pulled Sarah aside with tears in her eyes. "My sister disappeared 15 years ago," Dr. Chen said quietly. Her boyfriend claimed she'd left him for another man, but our family never believed it. Hearing your story makes me think we should push for a reinvestigation. Sarah spent an hour talking with Dr. Chen about resources for cold case advocacy, contacts at law enforcement agencies that specialized in missing person cases, and organizations that supported families seeking answers about disappeared loved ones. It was exactly the kind of conversation that made Sarah grateful she'd decided to speak publicly about her experience. The conference also marked a personal milestone for Sarah. It was the first time she'd told her complete story with Jake in the audience. He'd driven down from Humboldt County to support her presentation, and afterward they walked through the UC Davis campus together, discussing her decision to become a more public advocate for survivor rights. "I'm proud of you for sharing your experience," Jake said, as they sat by a fountain surrounded by oak trees. "I know how difficult it must be to relive those memories, but your perspective could help a lot of people. I'm still figuring out how much advocacy work I want to take on," Sarah admitted. "I don't want my entire identity to be defined by what happened to me, but I also recognize that my experience gives me a unique platform to help others." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe that's the balance, using your voice when it can make a difference, but not letting it consume your life." "Exactly. I want to honor Laura's memory and help prevent other women from suffering the same fate, but I also want to live fully in the present." They drove back to Humboldt County together, where Sarah had recently purchased a house overlooking the Pacific. It was a modest craftsman-style home built in the 1920s, with original hardwood floors and windows that framed spectacular ocean views. More importantly, it was entirely hers, chosen, purchased, and decorated according to her own preferences rather than anyone else's expectations. That evening, as they prepared dinner together in her kitchen, Jake brought up a topic they'd been discussing intermittently for months. "Sarah, I've been thinking about what you said at the conference today, about learning to trust your instincts and recognize genuine versus performative behavior. What about it?" Jake turned from the stove, where he was sautéing vegetables, his expression more serious than usual. "I want you to know that you can take all the time you need to feel completely sure about us. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not going to pressure you for any commitments you're not ready to make." Sarah felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, followed immediately by something new: confidence in her ability to evaluate Jake's character based on 2 years of consistent, respectful behavior. "Jake," she said, moving closer to him, "I do trust you. More than that, I trust myself to recognize the difference between genuine love and manipulative control. You've shown me what healthy partnership looks like." He smiled and pulled her into a gentle embrace. "Does this mean you're ready to make our living situation a little more official? Because I was thinking about putting my place on the market." Sarah laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "I think I'd like that very much." Later that night, as they sat on her deck watching stars reflect on the dark ocean, Sarah thought about the long journey from the locked box in Cedar Rapids to this moment of genuine happiness. Laura Coleman's courage in planning to leave David had ultimately saved not just Sarah's life, but potentially the lives of other women who might have become his victims. "Thank you," Sarah whispered to the Pacific wind, knowing that Laura, wherever she was now, would want her to embrace this second chance at love and life. The locked box had contained more than evidence of a decades-old crime. It had contained the key to Sarah's liberation from a relationship built on lies and the foundation for a future built on truth, trust, and the hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving betrayal and choosing to love again. As Jake's hand found hers in the starlight, Sarah finally understood that the best way to honor the dead was to live fully, love courageously, and trust in the possibility that tomorrow could always be better than yesterday. The nightmare was over. The real life could finally begin.